Most murders worldwide are never solved. This fact quietly dismantles the comforting belief that justice is inevitable. Popular culture trains us to expect clear motives, decisive investigations, and tidy resolutions, but reality rarely follows that script. In many places, homicide cases dissolve not because the crime was flawless, but because time, fear, and limited resources slowly erode every lead. Silence becomes more powerful than evidence. What makes this especially unsettling is how ordinary the failure is. Investigations stall when witnesses refuse to speak, evidence degrades, or authorities are overwhelmed. As months turn into years, urgency fades. Files are archived. Detectives move on. The victim's name becomes a line in a database rather than a life interrupted. Justice doesn't collapse dramatically. It fades unnoticed. For families, the damage is permanent. Without answers, grief never settles into closure. Every unknown detail becomes a place where the mind wanders, replaying possibilities that can never be confirmed. The absence of resolution keeps wounds open, stretching loss across decades instead of moments. The pattern is disturbingly consistent. Murders involving marginalized people, unstable neighborhoods, or chaotic circumstances are far more likely to be abandoned. Fear silences witnesses. Corruption redirects attention. Underfunded systems prioritize the present over the past, allowing perpetrators to return to ordinary life unseen. This reality alters how safety is felt rather than how it is measured. It plants a quiet understanding that accountability is fragile, that violence does not always produce answers, and that for many, justice is not denied loudly, but lost in silence. Human trafficking outearns drug trafficking. This fact exposes a disturbing hierarchy of exploitation where human lives have become the most profitable commodity on earth. Unlike drugs, which can be seized, consumed, and lost, a trafficked person can be sold, abused, and resold repeatedly. That repeatability is what turns suffering into a business model. Every hour, a victim remains trapped. Profit is extracted again and again, quietly compounding. What makes this reality harder to grasp is how invisible it is. Trafficking does not always look like chains or locked rooms. It hides behind job offers, fake relationships, debts that never shrink, and promises that slowly turn into threats. Victims often don't realize what's happening until escape is no longer simple or safe. Fear, isolation, and shame become tools of control more effective than physical force. This industry thrives because it adapts. Borders, laws, and enforcement shift, but traffickers adjust faster. They exploit poverty, conflict, migration, and desperation, targeting people who are already vulnerable and unlikely to be believed. Entire networks are built to move money cleanly while leaving victims silent and unseen. The psychological damage is as profitable as the physical control. Breaking someone's sense of self ensures compliance without resistance. Over time, survival replaces hope, and silence becomes safer than escape. This is why the trade grows unchecked, because it feeds on invisibility, fear, and the uncomfortable truth that human suffering can be endlessly monetized without leaving obvious traces behind. Some serial killers operate for decades. This fact is unsettling because it reveals how easily violence can blend into normal life. The idea that a single person can kill repeatedly over years without detection challenges the belief that danger is obvious or that evil announces itself. In reality, time is often a shield. When crimes are spread out, patterns blur, witnesses forget, and urgency fades. Each passing year lowers suspicion instead of raising it. What allows this to happen is not just intelligence or planning, but familiarity. Long-term offenders often appear ordinary, reliable, even trusted. They hold jobs, maintain relationships, and move through society without attracting attention. Their normalcy becomes camouflage, making it harder for authorities and communities to connect isolated incidents into a single truth. The system itself unintentionally helps. Jurisdictional boundaries prevent information from flowing freely. Evidence degrades. Investigators change. Cases are filed separately, never forming a complete picture. When victims come from different regions or vulnerable populations, their deaths are less likely to be linked, allowing the offender to continue unnoticed. Psychologically, this reality is disturbing because it suggests that time does not always expose wrongdoing. Instead, repetition can normalize absence. Families grieve alone, communities remain unaware, and the killer grows more confident with each success. The longer it continues, the less imaginable it becomes that it will ever stop, until chance, confession, or death finally interrupts a pattern that hid in plain sight for years. Criminal groups run legal front businesses. This fact is disturbing because it shows how crime doesn't always exist in the shadows. Often, it operates in daylight, behind clean storefronts, official paperwork, and smiling customer service. Front businesses create the illusion of legitimacy, allowing illegal activity to blend seamlessly into everyday life. To outsiders, nothing appears wrong, which is precisely why it works. These operations serve multiple purposes. They move illicit money through accounts that appear normal, masking its origin and making it difficult to trace. They also provide physical spaces where meetings, exchanges, and planning can occur without raising suspicion. A restaurant, car wash, construction company, or import business becomes more than a livelihood. It becomes a shield. What makes this especially unsettling is how trust is exploited. Customers, employees, and even local authorities interact with these businesses under the assumption of legality. Workers may unknowingly support criminal networks simply by doing their jobs. Communities can depend on these establishments, not realizing they are woven into something far darker beneath the surface. Psychologically, this blurs the line between safety and threat. When crime looks ordinary, it becomes harder to recognize and easier to ignore. The familiarity lowers defenses, allowing illegal activity to persist quietly. Over time, these businesses can gain influence, respect, and protection, making them even harder to challenge. Crime doesn't always hide from society. It sometimes disguises itself as a normal part of it, operating openly while remaining unseen. Thousands of murder victims remain unidentified. This fact is haunting because it represents lives erased not only by violence, but by anonymity. To be unidentified is to lose more than a name. It means no one officially knows who is missing, who is grieving, or who is waiting for answers. These victims exist in records as numbers, sketches, or DNA profiles, detached from the stories they once carried. What makes this reality persist is how easily people can fall through the cracks. Migration, homelessness, family estrangement, and poverty create conditions where disappearance goes unnoticed. When no one files a missing person report, a body can be found without a past attached to it. Time only deepens the silence as memories fade and connections dissolve. For investigators, identification becomes harder with every passing day. Physical features degrade, evidence is lost, and potential matches vanish as databases remain incomplete or fragmented. Even advances in forensic science cannot fully restore what time erases. Each unidentified victim becomes a stalled question, waiting for a recognition that may never come. Psychologically, this is deeply unsettling because it suggests a world where a person can be killed and effectively vanish. No funeral, no public grief, no justice demanded. The absence of a name allows the crime to feel unfinished, suspended in uncertainty. These unidentified victims linger as reminders that some lives disappear twice, once through death and again through being forgotten. Stolen identities sell for pocket change. This fact is unsettling because it reveals how little a person's life is worth in the digital underground. Years of personal history, your name, address, social security number, banking details, and habits can be bundled and sold for the cost of a cheap meal. What feels deeply personal and protected to you is, to criminals, just another disposable product. The reason this trade is so cheap is scale. Data breaches leak millions of identities at once, flooding black markets with supply. When something is abundant, its value drops, even if the consequences for the victim are devastating. Criminals don't need one perfect identity. They need thousands that mostly work. Failed attempts are discarded without thought, while successful ones spiral into financial ruin for someone else. What makes this especially disturbing is how invisible the damage can be at first. Victims often discover the theft months or years later, after loans are taken, records are altered, or credit is destroyed. By then, the identity has already changed hands multiple times, passed through networks that are impossible to trace backward. Psychologically, this creates a quiet vulnerability. It means security is not about being important or targeted. It's about being available. Anyone can be exploited simply by existing in a connected world. The cheap price of stolen identities reflects a colder truth. When harm can be automated and impersonal, empathy disappears, and people become data long before they realize they've been taken. Many crimes are never reported. This fact reveals a hidden layer of harm that never reaches official records. While statistics suggest trends and patterns, they only reflect what people are willing or able to disclose. Behind every reported crime are others that vanish in silence, carried privately by victims who decide that speaking up is more dangerous than staying quiet. Fear is the most common reason. Fear of retaliation, fear of not being believed, fear of social consequences, or fear of reliving the experience through questioning and scrutiny. For many, reporting a crime means exposing themselves to judgment, disbelief, or further harm. Silence becomes a form of self-protection rather than acceptance. Power dynamics play a major role. When the perpetrator holds authority, influence, or personal control, reporting feels pointless or risky. Victims may depend on the very people who hurt them for money, housing, or safety. In those situations, justice feels theoretical, while consequences feel immediate and real. Over time, unreported crimes distort reality. Communities appear safer than they are. Systems underestimate the scale of harm. Offenders learn that silence works, growing bolder with each act that goes unnoticed. The psychological weight on victims accumulates, turning unresolved fear into long-term anxiety, distrust, and isolation. This quiet absence of reports doesn't mean crimes didn't happen. It means they happen without witnesses, without records, and without accountability, existing only in memory, where they continue to shape lives long after the moment itself has passed. Illegal organ transplants happen quickly. This fact is disturbing because it exposes how speed becomes a weapon when human desperation meets profit. While legal transplant systems require years of waiting, layers of testing, and strict oversight, illegal networks bypass all of it. When money is involved, time collapses. What takes hospitals years can be arranged in days, sometimes hours, because the system is built to ignore ethics in favor of efficiency. The reason this is possible is painfully simple. Someone else pays the price. Organs are sourced from people who are poor, coerced, misled, or completely powerless. Consent is often manufactured through threats, debt, or false promises. In some cases, donors are never fully informed about the risk, or even whether they will survive the procedure. The urgency of the recipient becomes more important than the life of the source. These operations thrive in secrecy and speed. Fast scheduling leaves little room for questions, investigations, or intervention. Surgeons, brokers, and facilitators move quickly to reduce exposure, knowing that hesitation invites scrutiny. Paper trails are erased or never created. Once the transplant is complete, the system vanishes, leaving no accountability behind. Psychologically, this reality is chilling because it reframes time itself as something dangerous. The faster it happens, the less humanity remains in the process. Bodies become inventory, suffering becomes transactional, and survival is reduced to who can pay and who can be silenced quickly enough for the system to keep moving. Corrupt officials help criminals escape. This fact is unsettling because it reveals that danger doesn't always come from those breaking the law, but from those sworn to enforce it. When authority is compromised, justice becomes selective. A single bribe, favor, or political connection can undo months of investigation, allowing criminals to walk free while the system appears intact or on the surface. Corruption works quietly. Evidence is misplaced. Reports are altered. Warrants are delayed, and witnesses are discouraged. Nothing dramatic has to happen. Small decisions made behind closed doors slowly tilt the outcome. To the public, a case may seem weak or inconclusive, when in reality it was carefully dismantled from within. What makes this especially disturbing is the imbalance of power. Criminals protected by corrupt officials gain confidence, knowing consequences are negotiable. Victims, meanwhile, lose faith, not just in justice, but in truth itself. Reporting a crime can feel dangerous when those meant to protect you may be aligned with the threat. Psychologically, this fractures trust at a deep level. Laws are meant to provide order and safety, but corruption turns them into tools that serve whoever can pay or pressure enough. Over time, people learn that rules are flexible for some and absolute for others. This silent betrayal is what allows crime to persist, not through force alone, but through the quiet cooperation of power. Human bones are sold illegally. This fact is disturbing because it turns death into a marketplace. Human remains, which most cultures treat with reverence and care, are quietly trafficked as commodities. Skulls, skeletons, and individual bones are bought and sold through hidden networks that exploit gaps in law, oversight, and accountability. What should mark the end of a life instead becomes the beginning of a transaction. The trade survives by hiding behind legitimate demand. Bones are sought after for collectors, decoration, alternative medicine, occult practices, and even education. When legal supply is limited or regulated, illegal channels fill the gap. Graves are robbed, remains are diverted from crematoriums, or bodies are sourced from impoverished regions where oversight is weak and families lack the power to question what happens after death. What makes this especially unsettling is how easily respect disappears once a body is no longer recognizable as a person. Bones are stripped of identity, history, and dignity, reduced to objects that can be shipped, priced, and displayed. The anonymity protects sellers while erasing the humanity of the dead. Psychologically, this reality forces an uncomfortable realization. The boundary between reverence and exploitation is fragile. When systems fail, even the dead are not safe from profit-driven harm. The idea that someone's remains could be handled, sold, and circulated without consent introduces a quiet unease, reminding us that legality does not always align with morality, and that even in death, vulnerability can persist unseen. Contract killings still occur. This fact is disturbing because it confirms that murder can still be reduced to a transaction. A life can be priced, negotiated, and erased through intermediaries who ensure distance between the person who wants someone dead and the person who carries it out. This separation is what makes contract killings possible. Responsibility becomes diluted, buried beneath payments, aliases, and silence. Unlike crimes driven by impulse, contract killings are deliberate. They are planned patiently, sometimes for months, with attention paid to timing, routine, and deniability. The killer often has no emotional connection to the victim, which removes hesitation. To them, the act is a task, not a personal conflict. That emotional detachment is what makes these crimes especially chilling. What allows this to continue is structure. Networks exist to connect clients, brokers, and killers while keeping each layer insulated. Communication is fragmented, payments are laundered, and instructions are vague enough to limit exposure. Even when someone suspects a killing was arranged, proving it becomes nearly impossible without a confession or a mistake. The psychological impact extends beyond the victim. Knowing that death can be outsourced changes how trust works. Disputes, rivalries, and power struggles take on a darker edge when violence can be hired quietly rather than acted out publicly. It creates an environment where fear lingers without a visible source. Contract killings persist because they thrive on anonymity, patience, and the unsettling truth that in some systems, removing a person is easier than resolving a conflict. Wildlife trafficking funds crime networks. This fact is unsettling because it reveals how the destruction of nature quietly fuels human violence. Trafficked animals are not just victims of cruelty, they are currency. Ivory, scales, skins, and rare species are moved through the same routes used for weapons, drugs, and people, generating massive profits that flow directly into organized crime. What appears to be an environmental issue is, in reality, a financial engine for criminal power. The trade thrives because it feels distant. An animal killed in a remote forest seems disconnected from urban crime, yet the money travels fast. Profits are laundered, reinvested, and used to buy weapons, bribe officials, and expand influence. Each transaction strengthens networks that rely on instability and corruption to survive. Enforcement struggles to keep up. Borders are porous, penalties are often weak, and demand remains high. This allows traffickers to operate with minimal risk and high reward. In some regions, wildlife trafficking is treated as a low-priority crime, giving criminal organizations an easy and reliable income stream with little public attention. Psychologically, this reality is disturbing because it exposes how harm compounds quietly. The loss of a species, the funding of violence, and the erosion of law all stem from the same invisible transaction. Nature bleeds first, but the consequences spread outward, sustaining criminal systems that thrive on silence, distance, and the illusion that no one is directly being hurt. Fake drugs kill silently. This fact is terrifying because it unfolds without alarms, violence, or immediate suspicion. Counterfeit medications often look identical to real ones, packaged with convincing labels and familiar brand names. People take them trusting they are healing themselves, unaware that what they swallowed contains the wrong dosage, harmful fillers, or no active ingredient at all. The damage doesn't announce itself as a crime. It appears as a sudden complication, a failed treatment, or an unexplained death. What makes this especially dangerous is how slowly it reveals itself. Fake drugs don't always kill instantly. They allow illnesses to worsen untreated, infections to spread, and chronic conditions to spiral out of control. When death occurs, it is often attributed to the disease rather than the deception. The crime succeeds by blending into normal medical failure. This trade thrives on trust and desperation. People seeking affordable treatment, living in areas with limited health care, or buying medication online are especially vulnerable. Criminal networks exploit that need, turning illness into profit while remaining invisible. Unlike street drugs, counterfeit medicine moves through legitimate-looking supply chains, pharmacies, and online stores, protected by the assumption of safety. Psychologically, this creates a quiet fear, the idea that even help can be dangerous. It erodes confidence in systems meant to protect life and replaces certainty with doubt. The silence is what makes it deadly. There is no warning, no clear moment of betrayal, only the slow realization that something meant to heal has already done irreversible harm. Missing persons cases quietly go cold. This fact is unsettling because disappearance rarely ends with answers. Unlike crimes with clear scenes or timelines, missing persons cases fade slowly, almost invisibly. At first, there are searches, interviews, flyers, and urgency. Then time stretches, leads dry up, calls stop coming in. The case doesn't close with resolution. It simply loses momentum. What makes this especially disturbing is how silence replaces action. As days turn into months, attention shifts elsewhere. Detectives are reassigned, files are moved from desks to shelves. Unless new information appears, the case remains technically open while functionally abandoned. The missing person becomes a name attached to a date, not an active investigation. For families, this creates a unique kind of suffering. Without confirmation of death or survival, grief has nowhere to settle. Hope and dread coexist endlessly. Every unknown detail becomes a loop. The mind replays, searching for meaning that may never arrive. There is no closure, only waiting. The pattern is not random. Cases involving adults, marginalized individuals, or people without strong advocates are far more likely to stall. Lack of media attention, jurisdictional confusion, and limited resources quietly decide whose absence matters most. Over time, the disappearance becomes normalized, as if prolonged absence itself explains everything. Psychologically, this reality changes how people understand safety and permanence. It reveals how easily someone can slip out of record, out of urgency, and eventually out of collective memory. Not all losses are acknowledged loudly. Some are absorbed by time, unresolved, and unanswered, leaving only a quiet absence where a person used to be. Dark web markets last for years. This fact is unsettling because it shows how illegal economies can survive in plain digital obscurity. While takedowns and arrests make headlines, many marketplaces quietly operate for long stretches of time, adapting faster than enforcement can respond. Their longevity isn't accidental. It's engineered through anonymity, decentralization, and constant reinvention. These markets thrive by removing face-to-face risk. Buyers and sellers never meet, never know real names, and never see consequences unfold. Encryption, layered networks, and digital currencies create distance, not just from law enforcement, but from moral weight. Transactions feel abstract, making illegal acts feel less real and more routine. Trust, paradoxically, is what keeps these markets alive. Reputation systems, reviews, and escrow services mimic legitimate platforms, creating a sense of safety within an illegal space. Over time, users become comfortable, even dependent, treating the marketplace as stable infrastructure rather than a temporary risk. Psychologically, this changes how crime is perceived. When illegal access feels easy and reliable, hesitation erodes. The longer a market survives, the more normal it becomes, attracting users who might never engage in physical criminal networks. Its persistence suggests permanence, lowering fear and increasing participation. The most disturbing part is the silence. While authorities dismantle one site, others quietly continue, learning from past mistakes. Years pass, profits grow, and damage accumulates without spectacle, proving that in the digital age, crime doesn't need visibility to endure, only patience and a system designed to outlast attention. Trillions are laundered annually. This fact is unsettling because it reveals how deeply crime is woven into the global economy. Money laundering is not a fringe activity. It operates at a scale so large, it distorts markets, governments, and institutions without most people ever noticing. Illegal money doesn't stay hidden in cash-filled rooms. It flows through banks, businesses, real estate, and investments, quietly blending in with legitimate wealth. What makes this possible is complexity. Modern financial systems move money across borders in seconds, creating layers that obscure origins and responsibility. Shell companies, offshore accounts, and false transactions turn dirty money clean enough to be spent openly. Each layer adds distance between the crime and its profit, making accountability harder to reach. The emotional weight of this reality comes from its consequences. Laundered money strengthens criminal networks, fuels corruption, and undermines trust in institutions meant to protect the public. It allows drug empires, traffickers, and fraud rings to operate as if they were lawful enterprises, reinvesting profits to expand their reach. Psychologically, this creates a quiet imbalance. When illegal wealth is protected by systems designed for legitimate use, the line between right and wrong begins to blur. Hard work competes with hidden crime, and fairness becomes harder to believe in. The most disturbing part is not just the scale of the money, but how effortlessly it disappears into the world, unseen, reshaping power without ever announcing itself. Forced labor exists worldwide. This fact is disturbing because it contradicts the belief that slavery is a problem of the past. Forced labor doesn't always involve chains or visible violence. It often survives through debt, threats, withheld documents, and fear. People are trapped in jobs they cannot leave, working under conditions that slowly strip away autonomy while appearing legal or temporary from the outside. What allows this to persist is how quietly it operates. Forced labor hides in farms, factories, construction sites, fishing vessels, private homes, and supply chains that feed everyday products. Victims may appear employed, yet every hour of work deepens their entrapment. Wages are withheld, movement is restricted, and punishment is implied rather than stated. Control becomes routine. This system thrives on vulnerability. Poverty, migration, conflict, and lack of legal protection make people easy to exploit and hard to hear. Many victims fear deportation, retaliation, or arrest more than abuse itself. Reporting feels riskier than endurance. Over time, survival replaces resistance, and exploitation becomes normalized. Psychologically, forced labor is devastating because it erodes identity. When choice is removed gradually, people begin to doubt their right to escape. The world continues to benefit from their work while remaining unaware of the cost. This is what makes forced labor so enduring. It doesn't rely on secrecy alone, but on the uncomfortable truth that exploitation can exist in plain sight, woven into ordinary life, sustained by silence and necessity. Criminals pass background checks. This fact is disturbing because it exposes how fragile the systems of trust really are. Background checks are meant to act as filters, separating risk from safety, yet they often rely on incomplete records, outdated databases, and narrow definitions of wrongdoing. Passing a check doesn't mean someone is safe. It often only means they haven't been caught, charged, or properly recorded. What makes this unsettling is how normal the failure is. Crimes committed in different jurisdictions may never appear. Charges that were dropped, sealed, or never filed leave no trace. Entire histories can vanish behind paperwork gaps, plea deals, or administrative errors. In many cases, the system checks boxes, not behavior, allowing dangerous individuals to move freely into positions of trust. Time works in favor of the offender. As years pass, records expire, databases disconnect, and memories fade. Someone can reinvent themselves simply by relocating, changing employment paths, or benefiting from inconsistent reporting standards. The absence of data becomes mistaken for proof of innocence. Psychologically, this creates a quiet unease. It means safety is often assumed, not verified. Teachers, caregivers, co-workers, neighbors, and authority figures may carry hidden pasts that no form can reveal. The reassurance of clearance replaces genuine scrutiny, lowering defenses where they should remain intact. This reality forces an uncomfortable awareness. Systems designed to protect are only as strong as what they can see, and what they can't see, what was never recorded, never connected, or never believed, can pass straight through, unnoticed, trusted, and accepted as harmless. Evidence has framed innocence. This fact is terrifying because evidence is supposed to be the anchor of truth. When it becomes a weapon instead, the entire idea of justice destabilizes. Framing does not require elaborate conspiracies. It can happen through planted objects, coerced confessions, manipulated timelines, or selective presentation of facts. Once evidence points in one direction, everything else is often ignored. What makes this especially dangerous is how convincing it looks. Juries trust physical proof. Courts trust documentation. When evidence appears solid, doubt feels unreasonable, even when the story doesn't fully make sense. An innocent person can become trapped inside a narrative built from falsified or mishandled details, unable to escape because the system believes it has already found the answer. Pressure plays a major role. Investigators under scrutiny may focus on closing a case rather than correcting it. Confirmation bias sets in, causing contradictory information to be dismissed. Over time, the goal shifts from finding the truth to defending the version of events already accepted. The psychological damage is devastating. Innocent people lose years, families, and identity while living inside a reality where truth no longer protects them. Even when exoneration happens, the stain remains, and the lost time cannot be restored. This reality forces an uncomfortable awareness. Justice depends not only on facts, but on how they are handled. When evidence is trusted blindly, it can destroy lives just as easily as it is meant to protect them. Some crimes are hidden from the public. This fact is unsettling because it challenges the belief that awareness equals safety. Not every crime is meant to be known, and not every truth is released. Information can be delayed, buried, or quietly redirected under the justification of preventing panic, protecting reputations, or preserving stability. What the public sees is often a filtered version of reality, shaped by what is considered acceptable to reveal. Crimes may be concealed through classification, sealed records, non-disclosure agreements, or carefully worded statements that soften or obscure what actually occurred. In some cases, investigations are halted before they begin, and in others, outcomes are quietly redefined. The absence of headlines does not mean the absence of harm. It often means the harm was managed out of sight. This secrecy creates a psychological gap between reality and perception. When people are unaware of certain threats, they are unable to respond, question, or protect themselves fully. Silence becomes a form of control, shaping what is feared and what is ignored. Over time, trust erodes not because of what is known, but because of what is suspected. The most disturbing aspect is how easily this becomes normal. When concealment is framed as responsibility or protection, it justifies withholding truth indefinitely. Crimes don't need to be erased to lose their power. Sometimes they only need to be kept quiet, existing unseen while the world continues as if nothing happened. Spy tools are sold to stalkers. This fact is disturbing because it turns everyday technology into a weapon of quiet control. Tools designed for security, monitoring, or parental oversight are easily repurposed to invade someone's life without their knowledge. With minimal skill and little risk, a stalker can track locations, read messages, listen through microphones, and watch through cameras, all while remaining invisible. What makes this especially unsettling is how accessible it is. Many of these tools are marketed openly, disguised as productivity apps, tracking software, or relationship safeguards. Installation can take minutes, and once active, the victim may sense something is wrong without ever finding proof. The threat becomes psychological rather than physical, rooted in uncertainty and constant exposure. This kind of surveillance erodes personal safety slowly. Knowing or suspecting that someone can see where you go, who you talk to, and what you say creates a persistent state of fear. Privacy stops feeling real. Normal behaviors are altered. The victim begins to self-censor, Not because of rules, but because of the possibility of being watched. The emotional damage is profound because the violation has no visible boundary. There is no locked door to force open, no confrontation required. Control is maintained through access rather than force. This is why such tools are effective and dangerous. They allow obsession to masquerade as technology, turning intimacy into surveillance and making fear something that follows silently, everywhere. Smuggling routes constantly adapt. This fact is unsettling because it reveals that enforcement never truly catches up. Smuggling is not a fixed pathway, but a living system that responds instantly to pressure. When borders tighten, routes shift. When ports are monitored, smugglers move inland. Every new checkpoint simply becomes information, teaching networks where not to go next. What makes this especially disturbing is the speed of adaptation. Criminal networks share intelligence, track enforcement patterns, and exploit legal loopholes faster than laws can change. A route shut down today is replaced tomorrow, often more efficiently than before. Technology, corruption, and desperation fuel this evolution, allowing illicit goods and people to keep moving despite constant intervention. These routes often mirror legitimate trade paths, blending illegal movement into ordinary commerce. Trucks, ships, and flights that carry everyday goods can also carry contraband, making detection a matter of chance rather than certainty. The sheer volume of legal traffic becomes camouflage, overwhelming the systems meant to inspect it. Psychologically, this creates a sense of futility. It suggests that control is temporary and fragile, while exploitation is persistent. The idea that crime simply reroutes rather than disappears changes how borders, laws, and security are perceived. It shows that smuggling doesn't fight the system head-on. It studies it, learns from it, and quietly flows around it, adapting until resistance becomes just another obstacle already accounted for. Fake passports can fool authorities. This fact is disturbing because passports are meant to represent the highest level of identity verification. When a forged document can pass inspections, it exposes how fragile the systems of trust really are. A passport is not just paper. It is access to borders, safety, opportunity, and invisibility. When that access can be faked, identity itself becomes negotiable. What makes fake passports effective is precision. Modern forgeries are not crude imitations, but carefully engineered replicas, produced with high-quality materials, accurate serial formats, and believable data. Some are built using stolen or corrupted identity records, meaning the document itself may be technically valid even if the person holding it is not who they claim to be. This blurs the line between fake and real in ways that are hard to detect under pressure. Authorities rely on speed and consistency. Border agents process thousands of travelers daily, often with seconds to decide. In that environment, confidence matters. A calm demeanor, rehearsed details, and a document that passes automated checks can override instinct. Technology helps, but it is only as reliable as the data it compares against. The psychological impact is subtle but unsettling. Knowing that someone can erase their past and step into a new identity challenges the idea that movement is controlled or traceable. Criminals, fugitives, and traffickers don't need to hide forever. Sometimes they just need to become someone else. This reality reveals a deeper truth. Systems built on trust and verification are vulnerable not to chaos, but to precision. When identity can be convincingly rewritten, borders become less about protection and more about probability. Toxic waste is dumped illegally. This fact is disturbing because it reveals how danger can be buried rather than removed. Instead of being treated, contained, or disposed of safely, hazardous waste is often hidden in landfills, rivers, abandoned sites, or remote communities to avoid cost and accountability. The harm does not disappear. It is simply relocated to places where attention is unlikely and resistance is weak. What makes this especially unsettling is its invisibility. Toxic dumping rarely looks dramatic. There are no immediate alarms, no instant disasters. Chemicals seep slowly into soil and water, accumulating over years before symptoms appear. By the time illnesses rise or ecosystems collapse, the source is difficult to trace and responsibility is easy to deny. This practice thrives on inequality. Poor and marginalized communities are more likely to live near dumping sites, lacking the resources or political power to challenge what is happening beneath their feet. Children grow up drinking contaminated water, unaware that the damage was preventable and illegal. Psychologically, this creates a delayed fear. The danger is not felt in the moment, but in the uncertainty of the future. Every unexplained illness, every polluted stream becomes a question with no clear answer. The most unsettling part is knowing that the harm was not accidental. It was a decision made quietly, where profit mattered more than lives and silence was cheaper than responsibility. Prison gangs control outside crime. This fact is unsettling because it reveals that prison walls do not contain power. They often concentrate it. While incarceration is meant to isolate criminals from society, many gangs continue to operate seamlessly from inside cells. Orders are given through smuggled phones, coded messages, visitors, and corrupt intermediaries, allowing crimes to be planned and executed far beyond the prison gates. What makes this especially disturbing is how structured it is. Prison gangs often function like organized corporations with clear hierarchies, rules, and enforcement mechanisms. Members on the outside carry out extortion, drug trafficking, assaults, and murders on behalf of leaders who never leave their cells. Punishment for disobedience is swift and brutal, sometimes directed at family members to ensure loyalty. This system thrives because incarceration can strengthen criminal identity rather than dismantle it. Prisons bring offenders together, allowing gangs to recruit, indoctrinate, and consolidate control. Inside, violence and protection become currencies. Outside, fear maintains obedience. The separation between inside and outside becomes an illusion. Psychologically, this fractures the idea of safety. Knowing that someone locked away can still influence life on the street creates a sense that control is everywhere and nowhere at once. Communities may obey threats issued by unseen figures, and victims may feel there is no escape from reach or retaliation. Power no longer depends on presence. It survives through fear, reputation, and the certainty that even confinement does not mean silence. Cold cases are ignored. This fact is unsettling because it reveals how justice can slowly lose urgency without ever being denied outright. A cold case is not officially abandoned. It is simply left to sit in silence. Once immediate leads are exhausted, attention drifts elsewhere. New crimes arrive, resources are reassigned, and the unresolved past becomes an administrative burden rather than a moral one. What makes this especially disturbing is how quietly it happens. There is no announcement that an investigation has stalled. Files are moved, not closed. Names remain in databases, but no one is actively looking anymore. The case still exists on paper, yet in practice, it has been pushed into the background where time does the work of erasing pressure. For families, this creates a slow, exhausting form of grief. Every unanswered question remains alive. Each year without progress feels like confirmation that their loss matters less than the next headline. Hope doesn't disappear. It thins, stretched across decades, sustained by the possibility that someone might eventually care enough to reopen the file. The pattern follows resources and visibility. Cases without media attention, political pressure, or public outrage are the easiest to sideline. Evidence degrades, witnesses die, and memories fade, making reopening the case increasingly difficult and less appealing to institutions focused on efficiency. Psychologically, this reality is deeply unsettling. It suggests that time does not heal all wounds. Sometimes it simply buries them. It reveals that justice is not only about truth, but about attention. And once attention is gone, even the unanswered can be left behind, unresolved and quietly forgotten. Illegal experiments have occurred. This fact is disturbing because it exposes how easily ethics can be overridden when power, curiosity, or ambition go unchecked. Experiments meant to advance knowledge have at times crossed into exploitation, treating human beings as test subjects rather than people. Consent, safety, and dignity were ignored in favor of results, often justified as necessary or urgent. What makes these experiments especially unsettling is how they were often hidden behind authority, medical credentials, government backing, or institutional prestige created a shield that discouraged questioning. Participants were misled, uninformed, or deliberately deceived about risks and purposes. In some cases, harm was not an accident, but an accepted outcome. The damage extended beyond physical injury. Victims were left with long-term trauma, mistrust of institutions, and a sense that their lives were expendable. Communities affected by these experiments often carried generational fear, avoiding healthcare or research out of suspicion, shaped by betrayal. Psychologically, this reality fractures the idea of progress. Science is meant to improve lives, yet these events reveal how easily it can be weaponized when accountability disappears. The language of research can soften cruelty, turning suffering into data and pain into numbers. Illegal experiments persist in memory, not because they were rare, but because they were possible. They remind us that rules exist not to slow discovery, but to protect humanity from the temptation to sacrifice individuals in the name of advancement. Criminal records can vanish. This fact is unsettling because it exposes how accountability is not always permanent. A criminal record is often seen as an unchangeable truth, a documented history that follows someone for life. Yet, in reality, records can be altered, sealed, destroyed, or erased entirely through corruption, legal loopholes, bribery, or administrative manipulation. What once existed as proof can simply stop existing. This happens quietly, without announcement. Files are lost during transfers, databases fail to sync, jurisdictions don't communicate, or paperwork is deliberately mishandled. In more deliberate cases, influence and money accelerate the process. Charges are downgraded, convictions disappear from public view, or entire cases are reclassified. The system that promises memory can be taught to forget. The emotional weight of this fact lies in imbalance. Victims carry permanent consequences, trauma, loss, fear, while offenders may walk forward unmarked, legally clean, and socially trusted. A background check comes back empty. A history is rewritten. Society treats the person as harmless because the paper says so. Psychologically, this fractures trust in systems meant to protect. If records can vanish, then danger becomes harder to predict. People assume safety based on documentation that may be incomplete or false. The most disturbing part is not that mistakes happen, but that disappearance can be intentional. When history can be erased, justice becomes conditional, and the past stops being a warning, leaving others vulnerable to what was already known once and quietly removed. Orphans are recruited by gangs. This fact is disturbing because it exposes how absence becomes an opportunity for exploitation. Children without parents are not just lacking protection, they are lacking visibility. Gangs recognize this immediately. An orphan with no one to report their disappearance, no one to notice changes in behavior, and no one to intervene is easier to approach, manipulate, and absorb into criminal structures. Recruitment rarely begins with violence. It starts with attention, food, protection, and a sense of belonging. Gangs offer structure where none exists, identity where it has been stripped away, and loyalty in place of family. For a child growing up without stability, this can feel like rescue rather than recruitment. By the time control becomes obvious, emotional dependence has already formed. What makes this especially effective is how early it happens. Children are taught that survival depends on obedience, silence, and usefulness. Crime becomes normalized before alternatives are ever introduced. Over time, fear replaces choice, and loyalty is enforced through threats or violence disguised as discipline. Psychologically, this is devastating because it reshapes development itself. Morality becomes transactional. Trust is conditional. Violence becomes routine rather than shocking. The child grows into a role designed by others, often believing it was the only path available. Society rarely sees the beginning of this process, only the outcome, forgetting that many gang members were first victims long before they were labeled as threats. Most cybercrime goes unsolved. This fact is unsettling because it exposes how powerless accountability becomes once crime moves into the digital space. Unlike physical offenses, cybercrime leaves no visible scene, no clear suspect, and often no clear boundary. Attacks can originate from anywhere, pass through dozens of countries, and disappear behind layers of anonymity before anyone realizes damage has been done. What makes this especially disturbing is how routine it is. Millions of cases are reported, yet only a fraction ever lead to identification, let alone consequences. Jurisdictional limits slow investigations, outdated laws fail to apply, and overwhelmed agencies prioritize only the largest incidents. Smaller victims are left to absorb losses quietly, told to change passwords and move on. Time favors the offender. Digital evidence is fragile, easily altered or deleted. By the time an investigation begins, logs are gone, servers wiped, and trails intentionally poisoned. Criminals reuse methods, automate attacks, and move faster than systems designed to stop them. Psychologically, this creates a constant low-level vulnerability. It means security is provisional, not guaranteed. Anyone connected to the internet is exposed, regardless of caution or importance. The lack of resolution teaches a subtle lesson. Harm can occur without confrontation, theft without contact, and violation without recognition. This reality reshapes trust in technology itself. When most cybercrime goes unsolved, deterrence weakens, repetition increases, and invisibility becomes protection. The crime doesn't need to be perfect. It only needs to be digital, distant, and forgotten quickly enough for attention to drift elsewhere. Illegal adoption rings exist. This fact is deeply unsettling because it turns something meant to represent care, safety, and new beginnings into a covert marketplace. Behind the language of family and rescue, illegal adoption rings exploit desperation on both sides. Children become commodities, and paperwork becomes a tool for erasing origins rather than protecting lives. These operations thrive on imbalance. Vulnerable parents are coerced, misled, or stripped of choices through poverty, stigma, or outright deception. Some are told their children will receive education or temporary care only to lose them permanently. Others are pressured to sign documents they cannot read or fully understand. Once the child disappears into the system, reclaiming them becomes nearly impossible. On the other end, prospective adoptive parents may remain unaware. Forged records, falsified histories, and compliant intermediaries create the appearance of legality. Birth certificates are altered, identities rewritten, and timelines adjusted to remove any trace of wrongdoing. The child's past is not just hidden, it is replaced. The psychological damage runs deep. Children grow up with fractured identities, unanswered questions, and a sense that something is missing, but unnamed. Biological families carry unresolved grief, often without proof that their child is even alive. Trust in institutions meant to protect families erodes quietly. This reality is disturbing not because adoption is harmful, but because it can be exploited. When systems prioritize demand over ethics, care becomes commerce, and the most defenseless lives are reduced to transactions disguised as compassion. Billions in stolen art are missing. This fact is unsettling because it reveals how entire pieces of human history can simply vanish. Stolen art is not just property taken from a museum or collector. It is culture, memory, and identity removed from public view. Once stolen, these works often disappear into private vaults, criminal networks, or hidden collections, never to be seen again by the world that created them. The scale of this loss is hard to grasp. Paintings, sculptures, and artifacts worth billions circulate through black markets where ownership is disguised and origins are deliberately obscured. Unlike ordinary stolen goods, art can remain hidden indefinitely, pass quietly between buyers who value secrecy over visibility. Time becomes an accomplice, making recovery less likely with each passing year. What makes this especially disturbing is how powerless recovery efforts often are. Records are incomplete, borders complicate jurisdiction, and stolen works can be altered or fragmented to erase recognition. Even when pieces resurface, legal battles can stretch for decades, draining resources and momentum until silence returns. Psychologically, this creates a sense of permanent absence. Knowing that masterpieces exist but are intentionally hidden alters how we think about preservation and ownership. History survives, but out of reach, locked away by those who profit from its disappearance. The most haunting part is that these works are not destroyed. They are kept unseen, while the world is left with empty frames and unanswered questions about what has been quietly taken and never returned. Crime scenes get contaminated. This fact is unsettling because it shows how fragile truth really is. A crime scene is meant to preserve the story of what happened, yet it can be compromised within minutes. Curious onlookers step too close. First responders move objects to help victims. Weather alters evidence, or untrained handling transfers DNA where it doesn't belong. Each small disruption quietly distorts reality. What makes this especially dangerous is how invisible the damage can be. Once evidence is contaminated, it doesn't announce itself as unreliable. Fingerprints overlap, fibers travel, footprints blur, and timelines fracture. Investigators may build entire theories on details that no longer reflect the original event. From that moment on, every conclusion becomes less certain, even if it appears solid. This problem isn't always caused by negligence. Chaos, urgency, and human instinct play a role. People rush to help. Officers make split-second decisions. Scenes are entered before boundaries are secured. The intention may be right, but the consequences linger permanently. Evidence only gets one chance to be accurate. Psychologically, this is disturbing because it means justice can hinge on moments no one remembers making. A single misplaced step can redirect suspicion, protect the guilty, or implicate the innocent. Once contamination occurs, the truth doesn't disappear. It becomes blurred, contested, and vulnerable to doubt. The crime scene still speaks, but its voice is altered, and the difference may never be recognized, even when lives depend on it. Murders are ruled accidents. This fact is disturbing because it shows how easily violence can be erased by paperwork. When a death is labeled an accident, it immediately redirects attention away from intent, motive, and accountability. Once that label is applied, investigations narrow instead of expand. Questions stop being asked, and the possibility of foul play quietly fades from focus. What makes this especially unsettling is how often ambiguity works in favor of closure rather than truth. If evidence is unclear, witnesses are unreliable, or circumstances seem explainable enough, an accidental ruling becomes the path of least resistance. Overworked systems prefer explanations that end inquiries quickly. An accident closes a case. A murder opens years of work. These rulings are often shaped by absence rather than certainty. No obvious struggle, no clear suspect, no immediate contradiction. In those gaps, assumptions settle, time-sensitive evidence is lost, scenes are cleaned, and once the moment passes, revisiting the death becomes increasingly unlikely. What wasn't proven early becomes almost impossible to prove later. For families, this creates a unique kind of unease. Doubt lingers without validation. Something feels wrong, but there is no official space for that feeling to exist. Challenging the ruling requires resources, persistence, and emotional endurance most people don't have. Psychologically, this reality is unsettling because it reveals how truth can be shaped by convenience. It suggests that not all violence announces itself clearly, and not all justice fails loudly. Sometimes it disappears quietly, hidden beneath a conclusion that feels reasonable enough to stop looking any deeper. Legal guns enter illegal markets. This fact is disturbing because it reveals how easily legality can dissolve into violence. A firearm can begin its life registered, regulated, and lawfully purchased, only to resurface later in crimes far removed from its original owner. The transition from legal to illegal does not require chaos, only gaps, negligence, or intent. What enables this shift is circulation. Guns change hands through private sales, theft, straw purchases, and poorly monitored transfers. Each step creates distance from the original point of accountability. By the time a weapon is used in a crime, its trail is often fragmented or erased, making responsibility difficult to assign. The unsettling part is how ordinary this process is. A single legal transaction can feed an entire underground chain. Once a firearm enters the illegal market, it may be sold repeatedly, moved across borders, and used by multiple people. The weapon becomes permanent, while consequences remain abstract and delayed. Psychologically, this blurs the line between lawful ownership and unlawful harm. It creates a quiet awareness that systems designed for control are only as strong as their weakest oversight. The presence of regulations offers reassurance, yet the outcomes tell a different story. This reality fuels a cycle where legality becomes a starting point rather than a safeguard. When weapons outlive accountability, violence inherits momentum, and the distinction between lawful access and criminal use becomes less about intent and more about opportunity. Deaths are faked to hide crimes. This fact is disturbing because it reveals how reality itself can be rewritten. Death is meant to be final, documented, unquestionable, yet in some cases it is staged, manipulated, or falsely recorded to erase a crime or protect someone responsible. A body may be misidentified, a cause altered, or paperwork adjusted just enough to close a case without ever exposing the truth. What makes this possible is not theatrics, but systems. Death certificates rely on information provided by people, and people can lie, omit, or be pressured. Autopsies may be rushed, skipped, or influenced. Jurisdictions may lack resources or motivation to challenge inconsistencies. Once an official conclusion is written, it becomes difficult to reopen, no matter how fragile it was to begin with. The emotional impact of this reality is severe. Families accept explanations that never fully make sense, carrying quiet doubts they are told to let go of. Questions linger, but without proof, suspicion becomes grief's companion. Closure is manufactured, not earned. Psychologically, this is unsettling because it undermines trust in the most basic records of existence. If death itself can be falsified, then truth becomes conditional. Crimes don't always need to be perfectly hidden. They only need to be officially explained away. When paperwork replaces investigation, silence replaces justice, and a false ending becomes permanent, leaving the real story buried beneath an answer that was never true. Evidence rooms get robbed. This fact is disturbing because it reveals that even the places designed to safeguard truth are vulnerable. Evidence rooms are meant to be the final line of protection for objects that decide guilt or innocence. When they are compromised, justice doesn't just weaken, it can collapse entirely. Items vanish, are altered, or are quietly replaced, and the damage often isn't discovered until it's too late. What makes this especially unsettling is how rarely it's suspected. Evidence rooms are assumed to be secure by default, protected by protocol and authority, but access is limited to insiders, and that trust can be exploited. A single person with clearance can remove or tamper with crucial items without immediate detection. When chain of custody records are manipulated or ignored, the loss blends into routine bureaucracy. The impact is severe and often irreversible. Missing evidence can force cases to be dropped, convictions overturned, or investigations redirected away from the truth. Years of work can unravel instantly, not because facts were wrong, but because proof no longer exists. Victims lose answers. Defendants gain leverage. The system moves on as if nothing happened. Psychologically, this fractures confidence in justice at its core. If evidence itself isn't safe, certainty becomes impossible. It creates a quiet fear that outcomes are shaped not only by what happened, but by what survives storage. Truth becomes fragile, dependent on locked doors and human integrity. When those fail, the crime isn't just repeated, it's erased, leaving behind doubt where clarity was supposed to live. Some laws are never enforced. This fact is unsettling because it exposes the gap between what exists on paper and what exists in reality. Laws are often presented as firm boundaries, yet many function more like symbols than safeguards. When enforcement is rare or non-existent, a law becomes a suggestion, something acknowledged but not acted upon, visible yet powerless. What makes this especially disturbing is how quietly neglect becomes normalized. There is no announcement that a law has lost its power. It remains written, cited, and technically active, while violations are ignored in practice. Over time, people learn which rules matter and which ones don't, not through education, but through observation. Enforcement depends on resources, priorities, and politics. When agencies are underfunded or pressured to focus elsewhere, certain violations are deprioritized indefinitely. In other cases, enforcement is avoided because applying the law would inconvenience powerful interests or expose systemic failures. The law survives, but only as language, not action. Psychologically, this creates a distorted sense of order. It teaches that compliance is optional if consequences are unlikely. Those who follow the rules feel naive, while those who ignore them gain advantage. The system quietly rewards boldness over responsibility. This reality reshapes trust. If laws exist without enforcement, protection becomes conditional and uneven. Justice stops being a shared standard and becomes a selective process, applied only when convenient. The unsettling truth is not that laws are broken, but that some are allowed to be broken indefinitely, without consequence, while still pretending to stand guard. Informants commit crimes freely. This fact is unsettling because it exposes a hidden bargain at the core of many justice systems. Informants are often allowed to continue committing crimes in exchange for information, creating a space where illegality is tolerated, even protected, as long as it serves a larger objective. The crime does not stop. It is temporarily excused. What makes this dangerous is ambiguity. Informants exist in a gray zone where rules blur and accountability weakens. Law enforcement may look the other way as long as valuable intelligence flows upward. Minor crimes become acceptable, then serious ones. Over time, the line between cooperation and exploitation fades, and the informant learns that usefulness offers immunity. This dynamic creates a psychological shift. Power changes hands. Informants realize they are needed, which emboldens them. Some manipulate handlers, exaggerate threats, or fabricate information, to maintain protection. Others escalate their criminal behavior, knowing consequences are delayed or dismissed. The system meant to control crime ends up sustaining it. Victims rarely see justice. Crimes committed by informants often go unreported or unprosecuted, buried to preserve investigations or avoid exposing deals. For those harmed, the realization that their suffering was considered acceptable collateral damage deepens distrust in institutions meant to protect them. The emotional weight of this reality lies in contradiction. The law depends on criminals to stop crime, sacrificing consistency for strategy. While it may disrupt larger networks, it also normalizes selective justice, where wrongdoing is punished not by its harm, but by whether it remains useful to someone in power. Bodies are found by accident. This fact is unsettling because it shows how death can remain hidden, not through skill, but through chance. Many bodies are not discovered because someone was searching for them, but because someone stumbled into the truth unexpectedly. Construction workers digging foundations, hikers taking the wrong trail, farmers plowing fields, or homeowners renovating old properties become accidental witnesses to crimes that were never meant to resurface. What makes this disturbing is how long these bodies can remain undiscovered. Years, sometimes decades, pass while life continues above or around them. Neighborhoods grow, buildings rise, routines form, all while evidence of violence lies silently beneath. The absence of discovery creates the illusion that nothing happened, allowing perpetrators to move on without consequence. These accidental discoveries often expose how fragile investigations can be. Evidence has degraded, witnesses are gone, memories have faded, and records are incomplete. What remains is a body without context, a life reduced to fragments that may never fully explain what occurred. Justice becomes dependent on coincidence rather than intention. Psychologically, this reality is haunting because it reframes safety as randomness. It suggests that truth does not always emerge because systems work, but because chance intervenes. Every unexpected discovery carries the weight of lost time and unanswered questions, reminding us that some deaths remain hidden, not because they were cleverly concealed, but because no one happened to look in the right place until it was already too late. Gambling rings rig outcomes. This fact is unsettling because it reveals that chance is often an illusion. What appears to be luck, probability, or fair competition can be quietly engineered behind the scenes. Gambling rings manipulate results through bribed players, referees, dealers, software, or insiders with access to systems meant to be neutral. The outcome is decided long before anyone places a bet. What makes this especially disturbing is how invisible the manipulation is. Loss feels personal, like bad judgment or misfortune, rather than design. Winners and losers alike believe they participated in a fair game, unaware that the structure itself was compromised. The ring profits not by predicting outcomes, but by controlling them, ensuring the house or the syndicate never truly risks anything. These operations thrive on trust and scale. A single rigged event can affect thousands of bettors, spreading losses thin enough to avoid suspicion while generating massive profit. Technology has only expanded this reach. Online platforms, live betting, and data-driven odds create more entry points for interference, while complexity makes wrongdoing harder to detect or prove. Psychologically, this erodes the boundary between risk and deception. Gambling already plays on hope, desperation, and the belief that the next try could change everything. Rigging exploits that vulnerability, turning hope into a predictable revenue stream. Victims often blame themselves, not realizing the game was unwinnable from the start. The most unsettling part is how rarely it comes to light. Even when exposed, consequences are limited, and the system absorbs the damage quietly. The illusion of fairness remains intact, allowing manipulation to continue. Chance still looks like chance, even when it has been carefully deliberately removed. Serial arsonists vanish. This fact is unsettling because fire erases more than structures. It erases certainty. Arson scenes are chaotic by nature, destroying the very evidence needed to explain them. Heat warps timelines, smoke contaminates clues, and collapse buries origins. By the time investigators arrive, the story has already burned itself away, leaving behind guesses instead of answers. What makes this especially disturbing is how repetition hides in randomness. Fires appear isolated, written off as accidents, electrical faults, or negligence. Spread across neighborhoods and years, patterns blur. Different crews respond, different reports are filed, and no single perspective sees the full picture. The arsonist benefits from time, distance, and the assumption that fire is unpredictable. These offenders often blend into recovery itself. They watch alongside neighbors, volunteer help, express shock, even assist responders. Their presence feels supportive, familiar, harmless. Suspicion rarely lands on those who seem invested in rebuilding. Normalcy becomes cover, and familiarity becomes protection. Psychologically, this creates a quiet fear because fire feels impersonal. There is no confrontation, no warning, no visible threat to avoid. Damage arrives suddenly, then disappears into ash. When serial arsonists vanish, it reinforces the idea that some dangers don't linger. They return briefly, leave destruction, and dissolve back into ordinary life. The most unsettling part is not that they disappear, but that nothing announces their absence. Fires stop, attention moves on, and whatever drove the destruction remains unanswered, unexamined, and unresolved, waiting quietly, unseen, for conditions to align again. Spy footage is sold illegally. This fact is disturbing because it reveals how easily private moments can be turned into commodities. Footage captured without consent through hidden cameras, hacked devices, or compromised security systems can be copied, traded, and sold with little regard for the lives it exposes. Privacy does not disappear all at once. It is quietly harvested. What makes this especially unsettling is how ordinary the sources can be. Hotel rooms, rentals, workplaces, even homes become points of access. Cameras meant for safety are repurposed for profit. Once footage exists, control is lost. It can be duplicated endlessly, passed between strangers, and stored indefinitely, long after the moment itself has ended. The damage is psychological as much as it is personal. Victims often never know who has seen them or how far the footage has traveled. That uncertainty creates lasting fear, shame, and hypervigilance. Everyday spaces begin to feel unsafe, and trust in technology erodes into suspicion. This trade persists because it thrives on anonymity and demand. Buyers are removed from the act of surveillance, allowing them to consume invasions of privacy without confronting the harm. Sellers justify it as data, content, or curiosity, distancing themselves from responsibility. The most unsettling aspect is how invisible the crime is. There are no alarms, no immediate signs, no way to retrieve what has been taken. Once privacy is captured and sold, it becomes permanent, existing beyond the victim's reach, proof that surveillance does not end when the camera turns off. Witnesses disappear. This fact is disturbing because it turns truth into something fragile and temporary. A witness represents memory, accountability, and the possibility of justice. When that person vanishes, so does the narrative that could expose what really happened. Disappearances don't always mean sudden violence. Sometimes they unfold quietly through intimidation, relocation, silence, or pressure that makes staying visible feel more dangerous than disappearing. What makes this especially unsettling is how effective fear can be. Witnesses may receive threats that never need to be carried out. A warning, a pattern, or a single message is often enough to reshape behavior. People change routines, move cities, stop answering calls, or withdraw cooperation. Officially, nothing looks wrong. Unofficially, a case collapses. Systems struggle to respond because disappearance is not always a crime. A witness can legally refuse to testify, lose contact, or decline protection. When protection exists, it may arrive too late or feel insufficient. The responsibility to stay visible often falls on individuals facing forces far larger than themselves. Psychologically, this creates a chilling effect that extends beyond a single case. Others watching learn the lesson quickly. Speaking carries risk. Silence offers survival. Over time, this erodes collective trust in justice. Crimes don't need to eliminate every witness, only enough to create uncertainty. When witnesses disappear, the truth doesn't just weaken, it becomes negotiable, dependent not on facts, but on who is still willing and still alive to speak. Judges dismiss real cases. This fact is disturbing because it reveals how justice can end not with truth, but with a signature. A case does not need to be false or weak to be dismissed. It only needs to become inconvenient. Procedural errors, technicalities, political pressure, or overcrowded courts can abruptly shut the door on cases where real harm occurred and real accountability was possible. What makes this especially unsettling is how clean it looks from the outside. A dismissal appears orderly, lawful, and final. The paperwork is correct, the language is formal, and the system moves on. But beneath that surface, victims are left without answers, and perpetrators walk away not because they were innocent, but because the process failed them in a quiet, sanctioned way. These decisions often stem from systemic strain. Courts are overloaded, underfunded, and pressured to move quickly. Judges may prioritize efficiency over depth, stability over risk. In some cases, influence plays a role. Status, connections, or fear of consequences can weigh heavier than evidence. The law becomes something that can be navigated rather than enforced. Psychologically, this fractures trust at a deep level. When a real case is dismissed, it teaches victims that truth alone is not enough. It signals that justice is conditional, dependent on timing, resources, and power. Reporting a crime becomes a gamble, and silence can feel safer than participation. The most damaging part is not the dismissal itself, but the message it sends, that harm can be acknowledged, documented, and still set aside, leaving reality unresolved and accountability permanently out of reach. Secret prisons have existed. This fact is unsettling because it reveals how power can operate outside visibility while still claiming legitimacy. Secret prisons are designed not just to detain people, but to remove them from records, oversight, and public awareness. When someone is held in such a place, they are effectively erased from the legal system, existing in a space where rules no longer clearly apply. What makes this especially disturbing is how silence becomes a tool. Families are not notified, lawyers have no access, courts receive no documentation. Without acknowledgement, there is no timeline, no accountability, and no pressure to justify what happens inside. Detention becomes indefinite, shaped by secrecy rather than law. These prisons exist because they exploit fear and urgency. Under the justification of national security, emergency powers, or classified operations, normal safeguards are suspended. Once secrecy is allowed, it expands. Locations are hidden, budgets are obscured, and authority becomes concentrated among those who cannot be questioned publicly. Psychologically, this creates a chilling realization. Freedom depends not only on laws, but on visibility. If a system can hide a person completely, then rights become conditional rather than guaranteed. The existence of secret prisons suggests that legality can be bypassed when inconvenience outweighs transparency. The most disturbing aspect is not just what may happen inside these places, but how easily they can exist without most people ever knowing. Silence protects them, distance excuses them, and the absence of proof becomes the very reason they are allowed to continue, unseen and unchallenged. Crime syndicates, outlast governments. This fact is unsettling because it reveals a form of power that survives collapse, reform, and revolution. Governments rise and fall through elections, coups, and wars, but some criminal organizations endure through all of it, adapting quietly while authority resets around them. Their strength is not tied to ideology or law, but to continuity. What allows this longevity is flexibility. When laws change, syndicates shift methods. When leaders fall, replacements emerge. They embed themselves into communities, economies, and institutions, becoming harder to separate from daily life. Unlike governments, they are not burdened by transparency or public accountability. Survival, not legitimacy, is the only goal. These groups often exploit instability. During transitions of power, enforcement weakens and oversight fractures. Crime networks fill the gaps, offering money, protection, or services when official systems fail. Over time, they become the constant presence, while governments feel temporary. Psychologically, this creates a quiet erosion of trust. When people see the same criminal structures persist while flags and leaders change, belief in lasting reform weakens. Fear becomes normalized. Compliance replaces hope. The most disturbing element is how time works in their favor. With each passing regime, syndicates accumulate experience, influence, and patience. They learn how systems break and how people adapt. While governments promise order and justice, these organizations promise continuity. And in unstable environments, continuity can become more powerful than authority itself. Digital evidence can be altered. This fact is unsettling because it undermines the belief that technology guarantees truth. Digital records are often seen as precise, objective, and permanent, yet they exist as data that can be edited, overwritten, or manipulated without leaving obvious traces. Photos, videos, messages, timestamps, and logs can all be changed, sometimes subtly enough to pass scrutiny unless experts know exactly where to look. What makes this especially disturbing is accessibility. The tools needed to alter digital evidence are no longer rare or highly specialized. Software capable of editing metadata, cloning files, or modifying footage is widely available, and skill barriers continue to drop. A single adjustment can shift timelines, remove context, or create doubt where certainty once existed. This fragility affects investigations deeply. When digital evidence is questioned, entire cases can stall. Defense strategies often rely not on disproving guilt, but on introducing uncertainty. If evidence might be altered, even genuine proof becomes suspect. Truth competes with doubt, and doubt is often enough to protect wrongdoing. Psychologically, this creates a quiet unease about memory and reality. People trust what they see on screens, assuming digital records reflect what truly happened. Learning that these records can be reshaped challenges that trust, making reality feel negotiable. When evidence becomes editable, accountability weakens, and justice depends not only on facts, but on who controls the data, the tools, and the narrative surrounding it. Debt collectors use violence. This fact is disturbing because it exposes how money can override law and humanity at the same time. While debt collection is often imagined as letters, calls, and legal notices, in many parts of the world, it is enforced through fear. Violence becomes a shortcut when authority is weak or easily bypassed. Threats, beatings, property damage, and intimidation are used to turn financial obligation into physical danger. What makes this especially unsettling is how calculated it is. Violence is rarely random. It is applied strategically to send a message not just to one person, but to everyone watching. A broken window, a public assault, or a threat against family members is designed to demonstrate consequences. The goal is not injury alone, but compliance through terror. Once fear is established, force no longer needs to be constant. These practices thrive where people are vulnerable. Those already struggling financially are the least able to seek legal protection and the most afraid of escalation. Reporting abuse can invite retaliation, and law enforcement may be indifferent, overwhelmed, or complicit. Silence becomes a survival strategy. The debt grows, and so does the control. Psychologically, this creates a state of constant pressure. Every knock, call, or unfamiliar face triggers anxiety. Home stops feeling safe. Family members become leverage. The debt is no longer just financial. It becomes personal, physical, and inescapable. Over time, fear reshapes behavior, decisions, and identity. Violence doesn't just collect money, it collects power, turning obligation into domination and survival into submission. Stolen data never disappears. This fact is unsettling because it contradicts the instinctive belief that problems fade with time. In the digital world, once data is taken, it does not age, decay, or forget. Copies multiply instantly, spreading across servers, backups, and private collections beyond any single point of control. Deletion becomes symbolic rather than real. What makes this especially disturbing is how permanent the exposure is. Even if the original breach is fixed, the data continues to exist elsewhere, traded, archived, or resurfacing years later. Information can lie dormant until it becomes useful again, reappearing in fraud, blackmail, or impersonation long after the victim believes the threat has passed. This permanence changes the nature of harm. A single moment of compromise becomes a lifelong vulnerability. Criminals don't need to act immediately. They can wait, watch, and reuse stolen data as systems change and safeguards weaken. Time, which normally brings safety, becomes an advantage for the offender. Psychologically, this creates a lingering unease. It means control over personal information can be lost once and never fully regained. Apologies, updates, and reassurances cannot reverse exposure. The sense of ownership erodes, replaced by the awareness that parts of one's identity are circulating unseen. This reality reshapes how security is understood. Protection becomes about delay rather than prevention, and recovery becomes incomplete. When stolen data never disappears, the harm is not a single event, but a shadow that follows indefinitely, waiting for the moment it becomes valuable again. Crime stats are manipulated. This fact is unsettling because numbers are treated as truth. Statistics shape public fear, policy decisions, funding, and trust, yet they are only as honest as the systems producing them. When crime data is altered, reclassified, or selectively reported, reality itself is softened or distorted without most people ever noticing. Manipulation rarely looks dramatic. Crimes are downgraded to lesser offenses, reports are discouraged, or cases are quietly merged or excluded. A robbery becomes a lost property report. An assault is reframed as a disturbance. Each small change seems harmless on its own, but together they reshape the story being told. What drives this is pressure. Departments are judged by numbers. Cities compete over safety rankings. Political leaders want progress, not problems. When success is measured statistically, the incentive shifts from reducing crime to reducing its visibility. The result is a cleaner narrative rather than a safer reality. Psychologically, this creates a dangerous disconnect. Communities are told they are safer while experiencing the opposite. Victims feel dismissed when their experiences don't match official claims. Trust erodes quietly, replaced by cynicism and doubt. The most unsettling part is how persuasive manipulated data can be. Charts and percentages feel objective, authoritative, final, yet behind them are human choices about what counts, what is ignored, and what is hidden, reminding us that when crime is measured imperfectly, truth becomes negotiable. Medical waste enters rivers. This fact is disturbing because it shows how harm meant to be contained instead flows outward, unseen. Medical waste is supposed to be carefully treated, tracked, and destroyed, yet large amounts slip through improper disposal, illegal dumping, or failed systems. Needles, pharmaceuticals, blood-contaminated materials, and chemical residues find their way into waterways that people depend on for drinking, bathing, and farming. What makes this especially unsettling is how quietly it happens. Rivers do not signal danger immediately. Contamination spreads gradually, diluting just enough to avoid attention while still causing long-term damage. Antibiotics alter ecosystems. Hormones disrupt wildlife. Pathogens travel far beyond their point of origin. By the time effects are noticed, the source is often impossible to trace. This practice thrives on distance and neglect. Disposal shortcuts save money, especially when oversight is weak or corruption is present. Communities downstream rarely know what they are exposed to, and responsibility is blurred across facilities, contractors, and jurisdictions. Accountability dissolves into paperwork. Psychologically, this creates a deep sense of vulnerability. Water is assumed to be neutral, natural, safe. When it becomes a carrier of hidden waste, trust in the most basic resource erodes. Every glass poured, every river crossed carries an invisible question. The most unsettling part is knowing that this contamination is not accidental. It is the result of decisions made quietly, where convenience outweighed safety and the consequences were allowed to drift away with the current. Fugitives live openly. This fact is unsettling because it challenges the idea that running means hiding. Many fugitives are not lurking in shadows or constantly changing locations. Instead, they blend into ordinary life, holding jobs, forming relationships, and becoming familiar faces in their communities. The absence of suspicion becomes their greatest protection. What makes this possible is how systems fracture over distance and time. Jurisdictions fail to communicate, records are incomplete, and faces fade from public memory. As years pass, urgency dissolves, a wanted poster becomes outdated, a case loses priority, and the fugitive's past slowly detaches from their present. Normality becomes camouflage. Living openly also relies on social trust. People assume that someone who appears stable, polite, and consistent must be legitimate. Neighbors don't question routine. Employers don't investigate beyond surface checks. The world is built on the assumption that most people are who they claim to be, and fugitives exploit that assumption effortlessly. Psychologically, this is disturbing because it suggests that accountability is not constant. A person can cross an invisible line and re-enter society as if nothing happened. Victims remain frozen in the moment of harm, while the offender continues forward, accumulating new memories, milestones, and identities. The contrast creates a quiet imbalance where the past is inescapable for some and irrelevant for others, revealing how justice can be delayed not by complexity, but by time and normalcy, quietly doing the work of concealment. Professionals aid criminals. This fact is unsettling because it reveals that crime often relies on respectability to survive. Lawyers, accountants, doctors, engineers, and consultants possess knowledge that can protect, hide, or enable illegal activity without ever appearing overtly criminal. Their credentials provide credibility, and that credibility becomes a shield behind which wrongdoing can operate safely. What makes this especially disturbing is how normal the assistants can appear. Filing paperwork, structuring finances, offering advice, or overlooking irregularities can all be framed as routine professional work. The line between service and complicity blurs, especially when responsibility is fragmented and no single action looks illegal on its own. Crime doesn't always need force. It needs expertise. These professionals are valuable because they understand systems from the inside. They know where oversight is weak, which rules are flexible, and how to create plausible deniability. With the right guidance, criminal operations can appear compliant, regulated, and legitimate, reducing suspicion and extending their lifespan. Psychologically, this reality is deeply unsettling because it undermines trust in authority and expertise. The people society relies on for safety, ethics, and order can become enablers of harm. Their involvement suggests that crime is not just an external threat, but something woven into everyday structures. When professionals aid criminals, wrongdoing no longer looks chaotic or reckless. It becomes organized, protected, and difficult to confront. The most disturbing part is not that criminals seek help, but that the systems meant to uphold standards can be quietly repurposed to protect those who violate them. Torture creates false confessions. This fact is disturbing because it reveals how pain can override truth. Under extreme physical or psychological pressure, the human mind shifts from accuracy to survival. The goal is no longer to tell what happened, but to make the suffering stop. In that state, words lose their connection to reality. What makes torture especially dangerous is how convincing its results can appear. A confession feels like closure. It satisfies investigators, calms public outrage, and creates the illusion of resolution. Yet the information extracted is often unreliable, shaped by what the victim believes the interrogator wants to hear. The more pain applied, the more desperate the answers become. Fear fractures memory. Exhaustion distorts timelines. Repetition embeds false details until they feel real. Over time, some victims begin to doubt their own innocence, internalizing narratives forced upon them. The confession becomes a script learned under threat, not a recollection of truth. The psychological damage extends far beyond the interrogation room. Even after release, survivors carry trauma that reshapes identity, trust, and perception. For those wrongfully imprisoned, the confession becomes a permanent stain, overshadowing evidence and reason. The most unsettling aspect is how torture undermines justice itself. By prioritizing compliance over accuracy, it poisons investigations and allows real perpetrators to remain free. Pain may produce words, but it does not produce truth. Only silence, shaped to sound like answers. Missing people aren't always recorded. This fact is unsettling because it reveals how disappearance can happen without leaving a trace in any system meant to notice. When someone goes missing, it feels natural to assume their name is logged, tracked, and actively searched for. In reality, many disappearances never enter official databases at all. Paperwork is delayed, reports are dismissed, or cases are deemed voluntary absences before any real investigation begins. What makes this especially disturbing is how selective visibility can be. People without stable housing, migrants, runaways, the elderly, and those estranged from family are far more likely to vanish quietly. If no one pushes hard enough, or if authorities decide the case lacks urgency, the person effectively disappears twice, once from their life and once from the record meant to acknowledge it. This absence has lasting consequences. Without documentation, there is no case number, no cross-jurisdictional search, no comparison to unidentified remains. Even if a body is later found, there may be nothing to connect it back to the person who vanished. The system cannot solve what it never officially recognized. Psychologically, this reality is chilling because it exposes how existence can become conditional. Being missing does not always mean being searched for. It means being deemed worth the effort. Families who try to report loved ones often encounter skepticism, delay, or quiet dismissal, learning that persistence matters more than truth. The most disturbing part is how easily silence becomes permanent. When a disappearance is never recorded, it leaves no evidence that anyone was ever gone at all, only an absence that the world moves around, slowly forgetting that a person once stood there, waiting to be noticed. Gangs control neighborhoods. This fact is disturbing because it shows how authority can shift without being officially declared. In some neighborhoods, control does not come from laws or institutions, but from fear, reputation, and routine enforcement. Gangs establish invisible borders, dictate behavior, and decide what is allowed, all without formal power. Residents learn the rules quickly, often without them ever being spoken aloud. What makes this especially unsettling is how normalized it becomes. Violence doesn't need to be constant to be effective. A single incident, widely known, is enough to enforce compliance for years. People adjust where they walk, who they speak to, and when they leave their homes. Businesses pay for protection, witnesses stay silent, and crimes go unreported because the consequences of speaking out feel more immediate than the promise of justice. This control thrives in spaces where trust in institutions has eroded. When police response is slow, inconsistent, or absent, gangs fill the vacuum. They offer predictability, even if it is violent. Over time, residents may rely on gang approval more than legal protection, not out of loyalty, but survival. Authority becomes local, personal, and enforced face-to-face. Psychologically, this reshapes daily life. Fear becomes ambient rather than acute, always present but rarely acknowledged. Children grow up learning boundaries defined by threat, not law. Normal behaviors carry risk, and silence feels like safety. The most unsettling part is how invisible this control can be from the outside. A neighborhood may look ordinary, while inside, it operates under an entirely different set of rules, maintained not by law, but by the quiet certainty that disobedience will be remembered. Illegal DNA databases exist. This fact is unsettling because it means the most personal identifier you possess can be collected, stored, and traded without your knowledge or consent. DNA is not just data. It is a biological blueprint that reveals ancestry, health risks, physical traits, and familial connections. When this information exists outside legal oversight, control over identity shifts away from the individual entirely. What makes this especially disturbing is how quietly these databases form. DNA can be gathered through discarded items, medical leaks, hacked genealogy services, or unauthorized sharing between entities. Once collected, it can be copied endlessly, analyzed repeatedly, and combined with other data to build profiles far more invasive than fingerprints or passwords. These databases thrive in legal gray zones. Laws struggle to keep pace with genetic technology, and enforcement is fragmented across borders. What is illegal in one country may be ignored in another, allowing DNA to move freely while accountability stops at jurisdictional lines. The permanence of genetic data makes every leak irreversible. Psychologically, this creates a profound sense of exposure. Unlike a password, DNA cannot be changed. Knowing that genetic information could exist in unknown hands introduces a quiet, persistent vulnerability. It affects not just one person, but entire families, linking relatives who never agreed to be part of any system. This reality reshapes privacy itself. When illegal DNA databases exist, anonymity becomes fragile and consent becomes optional. Identity is no longer something you fully own. It is something that can be extracted, stored, and reused indefinitely, long after you stop thinking anyone is looking. Predators target forgotten people. This fact is chilling because it exposes how violence follows visibility. Predators rarely choose victims at random. They choose those least likely to be missed, believed, or protected. People on the margins of society become invisible shields, not because they are weak, but because systems fail to look for them. What makes this pattern so effective is silence. Forgotten people often lack strong social ties, stable housing, or institutional support. When they disappear, there is no immediate alarm, no press coverage, no pressure to investigate. Absence blends into expectation. Predators understand this and exploit it with patience and precision. Over time, this creates a feedback loop. Crimes against the overlooked go underreported and underinvestigated, reinforcing the belief that these lives matter less. Offenders grow bolder as patterns remain unchallenged. Each successful act confirms that invisibility works. The psychological weight of this reality is heavy. It forces an uncomfortable recognition that safety is not evenly distributed. Some lives trigger urgency, while others fade quietly. For those living on the edges, danger is constant and unacknowledged, woven into daily survival. The most disturbing part is how ordinary this becomes. Predators do not need sophistication when neglect does the work for them. They rely on gaps in empathy, resources, and attention. In a world where being seen often determines protection, being forgotten becomes the most dangerous condition of all. Victim protections are ignored. This fact is unsettling because it exposes the gap between what is promised and what is practiced. Laws and policies often declare that victims will be protected, supported, and believed, yet those protections frequently exist only on paper. In real situations, enforcement is inconsistent, delayed, or absent altogether, leaving victims exposed at the moment they are most vulnerable. What makes this especially disturbing is how normalized the failure becomes. Victims are told to wait, to be patient, to gather more proof, or to return later. Protective orders go unenforced. Confidential information is mishandled. Requests for safety measures are minimized until something worse happens. The system meant to reduce harm often responds only after harm escalates. Fear plays a central role. When victims realize protections are unreliable, reporting becomes a risk rather than a safeguard. Speaking up can mean retaliation, disbelief, or being forced into repeated contact with the person who caused the harm. Over time, silence feels safer than trust. The protection that should empower instead discourages action. Psychologically, this creates a deep sense of abandonment. Victims are asked to rely on systems that repeatedly show they cannot be relied on. The burden shifts from institutions to individuals, forcing them to manage danger alone. This erosion of trust does not stay contained to one case. It spreads, teaching others to expect neglect rather than support. The most unsettling part is that the failure is rarely dramatic. It happens through missed calls, unreturned emails, delayed responses, and quiet inaction. Protections are not denied outright. They are simply not used, leaving victims officially protected and practically alone. Forced labor exists in rich countries. This fact is disturbing because it shatters the assumption that wealth eliminates exploitation. Forced labor is often imagined as something distant, tied to poverty or unstable regions, yet it persists quietly within developed nations. It hides behind legal systems, modern infrastructure, and respectable economies, making it harder to recognize and easier to deny. What allows this to exist is subtle control rather than overt violence. Workers are trapped through withheld passports, fabricated debts, threats of deportation, or manipulation of legal status. On paper, everything appears legitimate. In reality, freedom is conditional and escape feels dangerous. The work continues not because people choose it, but because the cost of leaving feels unbearable. This exploitation often occurs in plain sight. It exists in agriculture, domestic work, construction, hospitality, caregiving, and supply chains that support everyday comfort. The people affected are frequently migrants, undocumented workers, or those with limited language skills, making them easy to silence and difficult to protect. Complaints risk retaliation, job loss, or removal from the country altogether. Psychologically, forced labor in wealthy nations is especially damaging because it relies on invisibility. Victims are surrounded by abundance, yet excluded from its protection. The contrast deepens isolation, creating a sense that suffering is personal failure rather than systemic abuse. Society continues to benefit from their labor, while rarely questioning the conditions behind it. The exploitation survives not through secrecy alone, but through disbelief. The idea that something so severe couldn't possibly exist in places that consider themselves advanced, lawful, and just. Solved crimes stay secret. This fact is unsettling because it challenges the assumption that truth naturally becomes public once justice is served. In reality, some cases are resolved quietly, contained within files, reports, or internal decisions that never reach public awareness. Closure exists for institutions, not for the people who were watching, waiting, or affected. What makes this especially disturbing is how deliberate the silence can be. Information may be withheld to protect ongoing operations, avoid political fallout, preserve reputations, or prevent public panic. In some cases, revealing the truth would expose systemic failures or implicate powerful individuals. Silence becomes a form of damage control rather than an absence of answers. For victims and families, secrecy creates a fractured sense of justice. Knowing that answers exist but are inaccessible keeps wounds open in a different way. The truth is no longer missing, it is locked away. The emotional impact lingers because resolution without acknowledgement feels incomplete and impersonal. Psychologically, this alters how people perceive accountability. If crimes can be solved without being revealed, justice becomes something that happens behind closed doors. The public narrative remains unfinished, while reality moves on privately. This reality reinforces a quiet imbalance of power. Those who control information decide which truths matter enough to be shared. When solved crimes stay secret, transparency becomes optional, trust erodes subtly, and the boundary between protection and concealment blurs, leaving people aware that answers may exist somewhere, just not where they can be seen. Evidence is destroyed for power. This fact is disturbing because it shows how truth can be treated as an obstacle rather than a foundation. When evidence threatens authority, reputation, or control, it becomes dangerous to those in power. Destroying it is not an act of chaos, but of strategy, designed to preserve influence while erasing accountability. What makes this especially chilling is how quietly it happens. Files go missing, records are mislabeled, physical proof is lost, damaged, or deemed unusable. Each action appears procedural, accidental, or justified. Yet the outcome is the same. The story can no longer be proven. Without evidence, wrongdoing becomes unchallengeable. Power reshapes priorities. Institutions tasked with protecting truth may instead protect themselves. Careers, political stability, and public image take precedence over justice. Once destruction occurs, denial becomes easy. Doubt replaces certainty, and time finishes what sabotage begins. The psychological impact reaches far beyond a single case. Victims are forced to relive harm without validation. Whistleblowers are silenced through futility. The public learns slowly that facts are fragile when they collide with influence. The most unsettling truth is that evidence does not disappear randomly. It vanishes where it threatens the status quo. When power decides what can exist and what must be erased, truth becomes conditional and justice becomes something granted, not guaranteed. Financial scams destroy towns. This fact is unsettling because it shows how devastation doesn't always arrive with violence or warning. Financial scams can hollow out entire communities quietly, moving through trust instead of force. When a town is targeted through fraudulent investments, fake development projects, pension theft, or mass lending schemes, the damage spreads far beyond individual victims. One collapse can ripple through every home, business, and relationship. What makes this especially disturbing is how believable these schemes are. They often promise stability, growth, or recovery, exploiting economic fear and hope at the same time. Local leaders may endorse them. Neighbors encourage neighbors to join. Money circulates just long enough to feel real before it vanishes, taking savings, retirements, and futures with it. When the scam collapses, the aftermath is brutal. Businesses close overnight. Property values crash. Public services lose funding. Families are forced to leave in search of work, fracturing communities that took generations to build. Depression, addiction, and suicide rates often rise, not because people were careless, but because trust itself was weaponized against them. Psychologically, this kind of loss cuts deeper than theft. It creates collective shame and silence. Victims blame themselves, even when the deception was sophisticated and intentional. The town becomes known for what happened, not for what it was. Recovery is slow because money can return, but confidence rarely does. The most unsettling part is how invisible the crime feels once it's over. No crime scene remains, no clear villain stays behind. Just empty storefronts, broken routines, and a shared understanding that something essential was taken, and the place will never fully feel the same again. Police reports get changed. This fact is unsettling because it shows how reality can be altered at the very moment it is supposed to be preserved. Police reports are treated as objective records, trusted by courts, investigators, and the public as the foundation of truth. When those records are changed, the version of events that survives may no longer reflect what actually happened, only what was allowed to be written down. What makes this especially disturbing is how subtle it can be. Changes don't always look like lies. Details are softened, timelines adjusted, language reframed. A suspect becomes unidentified. Force becomes necessary. A witness statement is summarized instead of quoted. Each edit seems minor on its own, but together they reshape the narrative in ways that protect institutions or individuals rather than accuracy. These alterations often occur under pressure. Officers may be encouraged to align reports, avoid liability, or prevent public scrutiny. Supervisors review language. Legal considerations override precision. In some cases, reports are changed to justify actions after the fact, turning documentation into defense rather than record. Once finalized, the report becomes difficult to challenge, even when it conflicts with evidence or testimony. Psychologically, this erodes trust at a fundamental level. When official records can be adjusted, truth feels negotiable. Victims may recognize their experience has been rewritten in a way that minimizes harm or shifts blame, leaving them feeling erased a second time. The most unsettling part is that these changes rarely look dramatic. They pass quietly through systems that depend on credibility, shaping outcomes long after the moment itself has ended. Crime photos are sold. This fact is unsettling because it turns moments of extreme human suffering into commodities. Images taken to document violence, death, and loss are sometimes removed from their original purpose and circulated for profit. What was meant to preserve truth for investigation becomes material for consumption, stripped of context and dignity. What makes this especially disturbing is how easily access can be abused. Crime scene photos pass through many hands, investigators, technicians, analysts, and each transfer creates opportunity. Once copied, control is lost. Images can be sold privately, traded in underground circles, or leaked into spaces where shock value outweighs ethics. The victim's final moments become content rather than evidence. For families, this creates a unique violation. Grief is compounded by the knowledge that strangers may be viewing, sharing, or profiting from the worst moment of someone they loved. There is no consent, no warning, and no way to reclaim what has been taken. The loss becomes public in the most intrusive way possible. Psychologically, this reality is disturbing because it reveals how desensitization works. When repeated exposure to violence becomes normalized, empathy erodes. The image stops representing a person and starts functioning as spectacle. Distance makes cruelty easier. This trade survives because it operates quietly, in spaces rarely monitored and difficult to trace. When crime photos are sold, the boundary between documentation and exploitation collapses, reminding us that even truth can be misused once it leaves the hands of those who were meant to protect it. Stolen items are auctioned. This fact is unsettling because it reveals how theft doesn't always end in secrecy. Instead of being hidden, stolen items are often displayed, valued, and sold in structured environments designed to legitimize them. An auction transforms loss into spectacle, stripping objects of their history and replacing it with a price tag. What makes this especially disturbing is the process of cleansing. Provenance is altered, paperwork is forged or conveniently incomplete, and ownership histories are blurred just enough to pass scrutiny. Once an item enters an auction house or private sale, it gains an air of legitimacy. The theft that began the journey fades behind polished catalogs and professional language. For victims, this creates a deep sense of helplessness. Seeing stolen possessions resurface as commodities, sometimes even publicly, reinforces the idea that recovery is unlikely. Even when suspicions arise, proving original ownership can be nearly impossible, especially if years have passed or records were destroyed. Psychologically, auctions distance buyers from responsibility. Competitive bidding reframes the object as a prize rather than a stolen piece of someone's life. Desire overtakes doubt, and the transaction feels clean despite its origin. The most unsettling aspect is how normal this becomes. Theft feeds into systems built for transparency, yet those systems can be manipulated to protect buyers, sellers, and reputations. When stolen items are auctioned, crime doesn't hide. It blends into legitimacy, carried forward by process and profit. Clerical errors free criminals. This fact is unsettling because it shows how justice can fail without malice, intention, or drama. A missed deadline, a wrong code entered, a document filed incorrectly, or a form never processed can undo months or years of investigation. The system depends on precision, yet it is operated by humans, and small administrative mistakes can carry enormous consequences. What makes this especially disturbing is how ordinary these errors are. Courts run on volume and speed, not caution. Paperwork moves through multiple hands, departments, and databases, each step creating another opportunity for something to go wrong. A warrant expires unnoticed. Charges are dismissed due to procedural timelines. A name is misspelled, severing the link between a person and their record. Legally, the system must let the person go. For victims, this feels like betrayal without explanation. The crime does not change, the harm does not lessen, yet accountability evaporates because of technical failure. There is rarely an apology, rarely consequences for the error. The release is lawful, even if it feels deeply unjust. Psychologically, this reality erodes confidence in fairness. It suggests that freedom and punishment can hinge on bureaucracy rather than truth. Criminals learn that the system is not only something to fear, but something to wait out. Time, complexity, and overload become tools. The most unsettling part is how invisible the failure is. No alarm sound, no public acknowledgement follows. A person simply walks free, not because they were proven innocent, but because the system misfired quietly, and the cost of that mistake is absorbed by everyone except the one who caused it. Crime infiltrates politics. This fact is disturbing because it reveals how power can be quietly repurposed. Politics is meant to regulate society, protect the public, and enforce accountability. When criminal influence enters that space, the system does not collapse. It bends. Laws are shaped, enforcement is redirected, and decisions are made to serve hidden interests rather than the public good, all while maintaining the appearance of legitimacy. What makes this especially unsettling is how gradual the process is. Influence rarely arrives as overt control. It begins with campaign donations, favors, lobbying, or mutual protection. Over time, criminals gain access to decision makers, information, and legal shields. Policies are adjusted subtly, investigations stall, oversight weakens. The changes are small enough to avoid attention, but powerful enough to alter outcomes. This infiltration thrives because politics already operates in complexity and compromise. Criminal groups exploit loopholes, bureaucratic delays, and the need for funding. Once embedded, they no longer need to break the law openly. They help write or selectively enforce it. Accountability becomes fragmented, and responsibility is diffused across committees, agencies, and procedures. Psychologically, this damages public trust in a deep and lasting way. When people suspect that crime shapes policy, cynicism replaces participation. Voting feels symbolic rather than meaningful. Justice feels selective rather than equal. The most unsettling part is that the system continues to function, passing laws and holding elections, while its purpose is quietly redirected. Crime doesn't overthrow politics. It uses it, operating through the same structures meant to stop it, protected by complexity, authority, and the belief that corruption must look obvious to be real. Hospitals ran illegal tests. This fact is unsettling because it violates one of the deepest assumptions people carry, that medical spaces exist to heal, not to exploit. Hospitals symbolize safety, expertise, and ethical care, yet history shows that those same environments have sometimes been used to conduct experiments without consent, transparency, or accountability. Trust became the entry point, not the protection. What makes this especially disturbing is how easily authority suppresses suspicion. Patients assume procedures are necessary, approved, and safe because they are presented by professionals in sterile rooms with reassuring language. In some cases, tests were justified as treatment, research was disguised as care, and risks were minimized or never explained at all. Consent became a formality rather than a choice. These abuses often targeted the vulnerable, marginalized communities, the poor, the institutionalized, and those with limited medical literacy were disproportionately affected. They were less likely to question authority and less likely to be believed afterward. Oversight failed not because rules didn't exist, but because enforcement relied on the same institutions committing the violations. Psychologically, this reality is deeply destabilizing. It reframes trust as a liability. If a place designed to protect life can also exploit it under the cover of progress or necessity, then safety becomes conditional rather than guaranteed. The harm extends beyond physical damage into lasting fear and skepticism. The most disturbing part is how quietly these truths surface. Years or decades later, records emerge, apologies are issued, and responsibility dissolves into bureaucracy. By then, the damage is irreversible and the lesson lingers. Ethics are not inherent to institutions. They depend on vigilance, visibility, and the willingness to question even those we are taught to trust completely. Confessions come years later. This fact is unsettling because it shows how truth can be delayed long after damage is done. Some confessions surface not days or months after a crime, but decades later, when memories have faded, evidence has degraded, and lives have already been shaped by unanswered questions. Time does not force honesty. Sometimes it merely makes it possible. What allows these delayed confessions is psychological pressure that never fully disappears. Guilt does not follow a schedule. It lingers quietly, resurfacing during moments of illness, aging, loss, or isolation. As control slips and mortality becomes unavoidable, the weight of secrecy grows heavier than the fear of consequences. Speaking becomes a release rather than a risk. In other cases, confessions emerge only when protection is gone. Death of accomplices, expiration of sentences, or changes in power structures remove the need for silence. What was once dangerous to admit becomes safe enough to say aloud. By then, the confession no longer threatens the confessor as much as it devastates those who waited for answers. The psychological impact on victims' families is profound. A late confession reopens grief, while offering incomplete closure. Knowing the truth does not restore lost time, undo wrongful convictions, or return years stolen by uncertainty. It answers questions that have already reshaped lives. The most disturbing part is what these confessions imply. Truth was always there, withheld by choice, circumstance, or fear. Justice was delayed not by mystery, but by silence. And silence, once broken, cannot give back what time has already taken. Phones can secretly track you. This fact is unsettling because it turns a personal device into a quiet observer. Phones are designed to stay close, to be trusted, to move everywhere their owner goes. That proximity makes them powerful tracking tools, often without the user realizing it. Location data can be collected through apps, system permissions, hidden software, or compromised networks, all operating silently in the background. What makes this especially disturbing is how normal it feels. Tracking doesn't require hacking in the dramatic sense. It can happen through permissions granted once and forgotten, apps that appear harmless, or services that continue running even when closed. Some tracking methods don't show up in obvious settings, making detection difficult for the average person. This creates real-world risk. Stalkers, abusive partners, private actors, and even criminal groups exploit phone tracking to monitor movements, routines, and social connections. Patterns emerge quickly, where someone sleeps, works, shops, and who they meet. Knowledge replaces presence, allowing control without physical proximity. Psychologically, this alters the sense of privacy. The idea that movement is observed without awareness creates a constant, low-level anxiety. Safe spaces begin to feel theoretical rather than real. Trust in technology weakens as convenience reveals its costs. The most unsettling part is how easily tracking blends into everyday life. Phones remain essential for work, safety, and connection, making avoidance unrealistic. The device meant to empower becomes something that can quietly betray, collecting pieces of a person's life not in moments of crisis, but continuously, patiently, and often without consent or notice. Victims get blamed. This fact is disturbing because it turns harm into responsibility. Instead of focusing on the person who caused the damage, attention shifts to the one who suffered it. Questions replace support. Behavior is scrutinized. Choices are dissected. The underlying message becomes clear. If the victim had acted differently, the harm might not have happened. What makes this especially damaging is how socially accepted it can be. Blame is often framed as concern, advice, or logic. People ask why someone was there, why they trusted that person, why they didn't leave sooner. These questions feel neutral on the surface, but they subtly suggest fault. The perpetrator fades into the background while the victim's decisions take center stage. This pattern serves a psychological purpose. Blaming victims creates distance from fear. If harm is caused by poor choices rather than unpredictability, then others can feel safer believing it won't happen to them. It restores a sense of control, even if that control is false. The cost of that comfort is empathy. Psychologically, victim blaming deepens trauma. It discourages reporting, isolates survivors, and reinforces shame. People begin to doubt their own experiences, questioning whether they deserve help at all. Silence feels safer than being judged. The most unsettling part is how invisible this process can be. No one has to deny the harm outright. They only have to reframe it. Responsibility shifts quietly, leaving victims carrying not just what happened to them, but the burden of explaining why it happened at all. Cars are stripped in hours. This fact is unsettling because it reveals how quickly property can vanish once it's targeted. A vehicle doesn't need days to disappear. In organized theft operations, it can be reduced to parts before the owner even realizes it's gone. What looks like an ordinary parking spot can quietly become the starting point of a rapid, efficient dismantling process. What makes this especially disturbing is the level of coordination involved. Stolen cars are moved immediately to secure locations, often within minutes, where teams work with practiced precision. Doors, engines, electronics, and frames are removed methodically, each piece destined for a different market. Speed is not improvisation, it's design. These operations thrive because demand is constant. Parts are easier to sell than whole vehicles and far harder to trace. Once separated, components lose their identity, blending into legal supply chains. By the time a report is filed, the car no longer exists as a single object, only as fragments scattered across systems. Psychologically, this creates a sense of sudden helplessness. Ownership feels fragile when something substantial can be erased so quickly. The loss isn't just financial, it's the realization that permanence is an illusion when efficiency and anonymity intersect. This reality also reshapes trust in recovery. Searching for the vehicle becomes symbolic rather than practical. The speed at which it was dismantled ensures that resolution is unlikely. When cars are stripped in hours, it highlights how modern crime favors precision over force, leaving behind absence instead of evidence. Hackers sell support packages. This fact is disturbing because it reveals how cybercrime has adopted the structure of legitimate business. Hacking is no longer just an act of skill or rebellion. It is a service industry. Support packages offer guidance, troubleshooting, updates, and even customer service, transforming illegal activity into something polished, accessible, and scalable. What makes this especially unsettling is how it lowers the barrier to entry. Someone doesn't need deep technical knowledge to cause harm anymore. With enough money, they can buy tools bundled with instructions, live assistance, and ongoing updates. When something breaks or fails, help is available. Crime becomes user-friendly. These packages create distance from responsibility. Buyers are not writing code or exploiting systems themselves. They are following steps provided by someone else. That separation makes the act feel less real, more like using software than committing a crime. Harm becomes abstract, reduced to clicks and dashboards rather than consequences. Psychologically, this normalization changes behavior. When illegal actions come with documentation and support, they feel routine and repeatable. Fear fades, confidence grows. The longer the service operates, the more legitimate it feels to those using it, even as damage spreads quietly to individuals, businesses, and institutions. The most unsettling aspect is the professionalism. Updates roll out, bugs are fixed, features are added. All of it reinforces the idea that cybercrime is not chaotic or fringe, but organized, reliable, and evolving. When crime offers customer support, it stops feeling temporary and starts feeling like infrastructure. Cold cases solved by chance. This fact is unsettling because it suggests that justice is not always driven by persistence or design, but by accident. Many cold cases remain unsolved not because the truth is unreachable, but because it is waiting for the right coincidence. A random confession, a forgotten piece of evidence, a routine traffic stop, or a new technology applied decades later can suddenly revive a case that had long been abandoned. What makes this especially disturbing is how passive it feels. Investigations stall as resources are redirected, detectives retire, and public attention fades. The case doesn't actively move toward resolution. It simply waits. Years pass while answers exist somewhere, unspoken and untouched, until chance intervenes. Closure becomes dependent on timing rather than intent. These breakthroughs often occur outside the original investigation. A family member submits DNA out of curiosity. A construction project uncovers remains. Someone speaks after carrying guilt for decades. None of these moments were planned to deliver justice, yet they become the turning point. The system didn't find the truth, it stumbled into it. Psychologically, this is deeply unsettling because it reframes justice as fragile and uneven. Families are left in limbo, knowing that answers may exist, but are not being actively pursued. Hope becomes quiet and uncertain, sustained not by progress, but by possibility. The most haunting part is that without chance, many of these cases would remain frozen forever, not because they were unsolvable, but because the moment that revealed the truth never happened. Records are erased for money. This fact is unsettling because it reveals how truth can be treated as a negotiable asset. Records are meant to preserve reality, arrests, charges, convictions, histories, but in some systems they can be altered or erased entirely if the right price is paid. What should be permanent becomes fragile, dependent not on facts, but on access and influence. What makes this especially disturbing is how quietly it happens. There is no dramatic deletion, no public acknowledgement. Files are amended, entries disappear, databases are adjusted, and suddenly a past no longer exists on paper. To the outside world, the absence of a record is mistaken for innocence, not manipulation. This practice thrives in gaps between systems, fragmented databases, outdated technology, and human gatekeepers create opportunities where oversight is weak. Corruption doesn't need to be widespread to be effective. A single compromise point can rewrite an entire narrative. Once altered, the false version becomes official, copied and trusted wherever it goes next. Psychologically, this destabilizes the idea of accountability. If history can be erased, then consequences become optional for those who can afford them. It creates a two-tier reality where some people carry permanent records while others shed them like inconveniences. The most unsettling part is not just that records can be erased, but that the erasure is invisible. There is no trace of the change, no sign that anything is missing. The system continues to function as if it were intact, while truth quietly disappears, sold and forgotten. Illegal detention sites existed. This fact is disturbing because it reveals how easily people can be removed from society without record, oversight, or accountability. These sites operated outside legal frameworks, meaning individuals could be held indefinitely without charges, trials, or acknowledgement of their existence. Once inside, a person effectively vanished. What makes this especially chilling is the secrecy. Families were given no explanations, no locations, and no timelines. Paper trails were deliberately avoided or erased, ensuring there was nothing to challenge. Without documentation, there was no way to prove abuse, neglect, or even survival. Silence became part of the structure. Power is what allowed these sites to function. Authorities justified them as necessary, temporary, or exceptional, using fear and urgency to override law. Rules designed to protect human rights were reframed as obstacles. In these spaces, control replaced justice, and compliance was extracted through isolation and uncertainty. The psychological damage was severe. Detainees experienced disorientation, helplessness, and identity erosion. Time lost meaning. Without legal recognition, even resistance felt pointless. Survivors carried long-term trauma, while those who never returned left families trapped in permanent ambiguity. The most unsettling truth is how invisible these places were while they operated. No signs, no records, no accountability. Their existence proves that when secrecy and authority combine, disappearance can be engineered and legality can be suspended without warning. Criminals hide in plain sight. This fact is unsettling because it contradicts the instinct to look for danger where it looks dangerous. Many criminals are not isolated, suspicious figures lurking at the edges of society. They are neighbors, co-workers, acquaintances, people who participate in routines, build trust, and appear ordinary. Normality becomes their most effective disguise. What makes this possible is how much society relies on surface signals. Stable jobs, polite behavior, and social integration create assumptions of safety. Once those assumptions are in place, scrutiny disappears. People stop questioning consistency and begin trusting familiarity. The longer someone blends in, the less imaginable it becomes that they could be hiding something severe. Time strengthens this invisibility. As years pass without suspicion, the idea of wrongdoing feels increasingly implausible. Even when small warning signs appear, they are rationalized away. Humans prefer coherent narratives, and the story of a normal person is easier to accept than the disruption of realizing harm has been close all along. Psychologically, this is disturbing because it reframes threat as intimate rather than distant. It suggests that danger does not always announce itself through chaos or instability. Instead, it can exist comfortably within routine, protected by trust and repetition. Victims may struggle to be believed because the image of the perpetrator feels incompatible with the accusation. The most unsettling part is not that criminals hide, but that they do so without effort, simply by participating in everyday life while everyone else assumes that what looks familiar must be safe. Evidence goes missing. This fact is unsettling because evidence is supposed to be the anchor of truth. It is what turns suspicion into proof and stories into facts. When evidence disappears, reality becomes negotiable. Without it, cases weaken, timelines fracture, and certainty dissolves into speculation. What remains is not justice, but doubt. What makes this especially disturbing is how ordinary the disappearance can be. Evidence passes through many hands, collected at scenes, logged, transported, stored, re-examined. Each step creates opportunity for loss, mishandling, contamination, or deliberate removal. Sometimes it's labeled an error. Sometimes it's never explained at all. Either way, the damage is permanent. Missing evidence doesn't just stall cases, it reshapes outcomes. Charges are reduced, trials collapse, guilty parties walk free while innocence becomes harder to prove. Once evidence is gone, it cannot be reconstructed, only argued about. The absence becomes a void where answers should have been. Psychologically, this creates a deep unease because it shows how fragile accountability really is. Justice depends not only on truth, but on preservation. If physical proof can vanish, then certainty becomes conditional, reliant on systems that are imperfect and vulnerable. The most unsettling part is how invisible the loss often is. There is no alarm when something crucial disappears. Life moves on, paperwork adjusts, and the system absorbs the gap without acknowledgement. Evidence doesn't need to be disproven to lose power. It only needs to be gone. Smuggling routes predate borders. This fact is unsettling because it reveals how movement and trade existed long before the lines meant to control them. Long before modern nations drew borders on maps, people were already transporting goods, resources, and people along established paths shaped by geography, necessity, and opportunity. When borders appeared, the routes did not disappear. They adapted. What makes this especially powerful is continuity. Mountains, rivers, deserts, and coastlines dictate movement more reliably than laws. Smuggling routes follow terrain, not policy. When borders shift or enforcement tightens, paths bend rather than break. Knowledge is passed down through generations, turning geography into an inherited advantage. This longevity makes smuggling difficult to eliminate. Enforcement responds to modern rules, while smuggling relies on ancient logic. Where people have always moved, they will continue to move. Communities along these routes often depend on them economically, blurring the line between survival and crime. Psychologically, this challenges the idea of control. Borders are presented as absolute, yet the persistence of these routes exposes their limits. Authority feels temporary compared to paths carved by centuries of use. The most unsettling aspect is how invisible this history is. Smuggling feels modern, but it is rooted in the past, woven into landscapes long before passports or checkpoints existed. Borders may redefine legality, but they rarely erase momentum built over generations of movement. Media is manipulated by criminals. This fact is disturbing because it reveals how perception can be shaped without force. Media is trusted to inform, expose, and warn, yet it can be quietly steered by those with something to hide. Criminals don't always silence stories, they redirect them. Through influence, money, intimidation, or strategic leaks, narratives are softened, delayed, or reframed until the truth loses its urgency. What makes this especially unsettling is how subtle the manipulation is. A story isn't erased, it's buried under distraction. Headlines change tone, details are omitted, language becomes vague, attention shifts elsewhere. To the audience, nothing seems wrong. Information still flows, but meaning is diluted. By the time facts emerge, public interest has moved on. This control often exploits the pressures media already faces. Tight deadlines, competition for clicks, reliance on sources, and fear of legal consequences create openings for influence. Criminal networks use public relations tactics, lawsuits, threats, or favors to manage coverage. In some cases, journalists are fed selective truths that protect larger crimes while exposing smaller ones. Psychologically, this erodes the public's ability to recognize harm. When crime is normalized, minimized, or sensationalized incorrectly, it stops feeling real. People become desensitized or misinformed, unsure what deserves concern. Victims may feel erased when their stories are distorted or ignored. The most unsettling part is that manipulation doesn't require total control, only enough influence to blur reality. When information itself becomes unreliable, accountability weakens, and crime gains a powerful shield. Confusion that looks like news. Fake reviews sell illegal goods. This fact is unsettling because it shows how trust is manufactured and weaponized. Reviews are meant to reflect real experiences, yet in illegal markets, they are carefully engineered tools of persuasion. A string of positive feedback creates legitimacy where none should exist, lowering skepticism and encouraging buyers to proceed without hesitation. What makes this especially disturbing is how convincing the illusion can be. Fake reviews are written to sound authentic, emotional, and specific. They mimic the language of real customers, reference believable details, and even include staged complaints to appear balanced. Over time, repetition creates credibility, and credibility replaces caution. People don't feel like they're taking a risk. They feel reassured. These reviews thrive because platforms are overwhelmed. Automated systems struggle to distinguish manipulation from genuine activity, especially when sellers use networks of accounts, rotating identities, and timed interactions. Once a product appears popular, algorithms can amplify it further, spreading visibility without understanding what's actually being sold. Psychologically, this creates a dangerous shortcut in decision-making. Humans rely on social proof to feel safe. When others appear satisfied, defenses drop. The presence of approval signals overrides warning signs, even when the transaction itself should raise concern. This reality reveals how easily perception can be shaped. Illegal goods don't need secrecy if they can simulate legitimacy. When fake reviews sell illegal goods, crime doesn't hide. It performs trust convincingly enough that people stop questioning what they're being led toward, believing reassurance instead of reality. Murders are labeled suicides. This fact is disturbing because it shows how easily truth can be buried under a convenient explanation. When a death is labeled a suicide, scrutiny often stops. The assumption of self-inflicted harm closes doors that homicide would force open. What should be the beginning of questions becomes the end of investigation. What allows this to happen is ambiguity. Many deaths exist in a gray area where intent is difficult to prove. Limited evidence, rushed assessments, or pressure to resolve cases quickly can push investigators toward the simplest conclusion. Once that label is applied, challenging it requires effort, resources, and willingness that are often absent. Power and reputation play a role. In cases involving influence, authority, or sensitive circumstances, a suicide ruling can protect institutions, individuals, or narratives from deeper exposure. It avoids scandal, lawsuits, and public outrage. The cost of truth becomes higher than the cost of silence. For families, the psychological damage is immense. Doubt lingers alongside grief. Questions remain unanswered, yet the official record denies them legitimacy. Challenging the ruling can feel like fighting a system that has already decided what is acceptable to believe. The most unsettling part is finality. A suicide label closes cases, statistics, and conversations. If it is wrong, the error does more than misclassify a death. It erases accountability. When murder is hidden behind explanation, justice is not denied loudly, but quietly rewritten. Human remains are resold. This fact is disturbing because it reveals how even death can be turned into a transaction. Bodies that were donated, unclaimed, or improperly handled can enter secondary markets where bones, organs, or entire remains are bought and sold. What begins as a medical, scientific, or charitable process quietly shifts into commerce, often without the knowledge or consent of families. What makes this especially unsettling is how bureaucratic it can be. Paperwork obscures movement. Terms like specimen, material, or remains replace the reality that these were once people with lives, identities, and loved ones. Oversight gaps allow bodies to be divided, transported, and resold across institutions, borders, and industries with little transparency. Once labeled inventory, accountability fades. This trade thrives in silence and trust. Families assume donated remains will be treated with respect. Institutions rely on third parties. Regulators lag behind evolving practices. Each step distances the human element further, making ethical lines easier to cross. By the time misuse is discovered, the remains may be scattered, altered, or impossible to recover. Psychologically, this is deeply unsettling because it strips dignity from what is meant to be sacred. Death is supposed to be a boundary, a moment where exploitation ends. When remains are resold, that boundary collapses. It introduces the idea that a person's value can persist as profit long after life has ended. The most haunting part is that this rarely looks like theft or abuse. It looks like procedure, legality, and routine, quietly transforming loss into merchandise while no one is watching closely enough to stop it. Repeat offenders walk free. This fact is unsettling because it exposes how persistence can outlast accountability. Systems designed to deter crime often respond slowly, inconsistently, or unevenly, allowing the same individuals to cycle through arrest, release, and reoffense. Each return to the street sends a quiet message that consequences are negotiable, temporary, or avoidable. What makes this especially disturbing is how predictable the pattern becomes. Charges are reduced, cases dismissed, sentences shortened, or supervision weakened by overcrowded courts and limited resources. Technicalities replace truth. Fatigue replaces vigilance. Over time, the focus shifts from preventing harm to managing it, and repetition becomes normalized rather than alarming. These outcomes are shaped by gaps, probation overloaded, records fragmented, risk assessments flawed. Past behavior, the strongest predictor of future behavior, is discounted when systems prioritize speed over scrutiny. The result is a revolving door where warning signs accumulate without triggering meaningful intervention. Psychologically, this erodes trust. Victims feel abandoned when harm repeats without resolution. Communities internalize a sense of inevitability, learning to expect recurrence rather than protection. The offender, emboldened by survival, grows more confident with each escape, adapting tactics to stay just ahead of consequences. The most unsettling part is not that mistakes happen, but that repetition is absorbed as routine. When repeat offenders walk free, justice appears conditional, applied unevenly, delayed endlessly, and weakened by the very processes meant to enforce it, leaving harm to recur while accountability remains perpetually postponed. Politics stops investigations. This fact is disturbing because it shows how truth can be blocked not by lack of evidence, but by influence. When an investigation threatens powerful interests, it can be slowed, redirected, or quietly shut down. The case doesn't fail because answers are impossible to find, but because finding them becomes inconvenient. What makes this especially unsettling is how subtle the interference can be. Funding is reduced, key personnel are reassigned, jurisdiction is questioned, priorities are re-evaluated. Each decision appears procedural, reasonable on its own, yet together they drain momentum until the investigation collapses under its own stagnation. Power shapes risk. Officials may fear political backlash, career damage, or institutional instability. Pursuing the truth becomes a liability rather than a duty. In these moments, neutrality disappears, replaced by calculation. Silence is framed as pragmatism, and inaction is justified as restraint. The psychological impact spreads beyond a single case. Victims and witnesses learn that justice has limits, and those limits are not moral but strategic. Trust erodes when people realize that some questions are dangerous to ask, not because they lack answers, but because the answers implicate the wrong people. The most unsettling truth is how normalized this becomes. Investigations don't need to be erased, they only need to be paused long enough for public attention to fade. When politics intervenes, justice doesn't end abruptly. It simply stops moving, leaving truth stranded in place while power moves on. Journalists are illegally surveilled. This fact is disturbing because it targets the very people meant to uncover truth. Journalists rely on confidentiality to investigate abuse, corruption, and crime. When they are secretly monitored, that protection collapses. Surveillance turns reporting into a risk, not just for the journalist, but for every source who dares to speak. What makes this especially unsettling is how quietly it happens. Phone records are accessed, emails intercepted, locations tracked, and contacts mapped without consent or oversight, often justified under vague claims of security or public interest. The surveillance rarely announces itself. Journalists may sense pressure, leaks drying up, or sources going silent long before they realize they are being watched. This practice thrives because of power imbalance. Governments, corporations, and criminal networks all benefit from knowing who is investigating them. By identifying sources, surveillance doesn't need to stop a story directly. It only needs to create fear. Once sources believe they can be exposed, cooperation disappears. Silence becomes safer than truth. Psychologically, this damages more than individual reporters. It erodes the flow of information society depends on. Stories remain untold not because they are false, but because the cost of telling them becomes too high. Journalists begin to self-censor. Sources withdraw. The public never learns what was close to being revealed. The most unsettling part is that this surveillance often exists in legal gray zones, hidden behind secrecy laws and unaccountable systems. There is rarely a courtroom moment or public reckoning. Instead, the damage spreads invisibly, weakening trust, discouraging scrutiny, and ensuring that power remains unchallenged, not by force, but by fear of being seen. Gangs replace governments locally. This fact is unsettling because it reveals how power fills a vacuum faster than institutions can respond. When governments fail to provide safety, resources, or stability, gangs step in, not as chaotic outsiders, but as organized authorities. They enforce rules, resolve disputes, collect payments, and decide who is protected and who is punished. Control becomes local, immediate, and unavoidable. What makes this especially disturbing is how normalized it becomes. residents learn which streets are safe, which behaviors are tolerated, and which rules matter more than the law. Gangs offer predictability where the state offers absence. Fear replaces legitimacy, but daily life continues, shaped by unwritten rules that carry real consequences. These groups maintain control through a mix of coercion and provision. They may supply food, jobs, loans, or protection, creating dependence alongside intimidation. Violence is selective, used strategically to reinforce authority rather than constantly display it. Over time, compliance feels less like submission and more like survival. Psychologically, this reshapes loyalty and trust. When the nearest source of order is criminal, morality becomes secondary to safety. Children grow up learning power from those who wield it most visibly. The idea of government becomes distant, abstract, and irrelevant compared to the force that actually governs daily life. The most unsettling part is how quietly this shift happens. There is no official transfer of power, no announcement of collapse. Authority simply changes hands at ground level, leaving the appearance of governance intact while real control operates elsewhere, embedded in fear, routine, and necessity. Legal trade hides smuggling. This fact is unsettling because it shows how crime can move through the same channels as ordinary commerce, unnoticed and unquestioned. Ships, trucks, warehouses, and shipping manifests are designed to move massive volumes of legitimate goods, and that scale creates cover. When millions of containers cross borders every year, only a fraction are ever inspected closely. Smuggling thrives in that excess. What makes this especially effective is familiarity. Legal trade is trusted by default. Paperwork looks official, routes are routine, and companies appear established. Illicit goods are hidden among legitimate cargo, mislabeled, underdeclared, or concealed within products that raise no suspicion. The crime doesn't break the system. It uses it exactly as intended. This creates distance from wrongdoing. Drivers, dock workers, clerks, and even managers may never know what they are transporting or processing. Responsibility fragments across supply chains until no single person sees the whole picture. Smuggling becomes a background process embedded in normal operations. Psychologically, this blurs the boundary between lawful and unlawful activity. When illegal goods move alongside everyday products, crime loses its sense of disruption. It feels routine, procedural, almost invisible. Enforcement struggles not because of incompetence, but because the system itself prioritizes speed and volume over certainty. The most disturbing aspect is how sustainable this makes smuggling. As long as global trade depends on trust, efficiency, and scale, it will continue to offer shelter for hidden cargo. Crime doesn't need secret routes when it can travel openly, disguised as business as usual. Criminals trade info for freedom. This fact is unsettling because it turns justice into a negotiation. Instead of accountability being absolute, it becomes conditional. A criminal who knows enough can reduce charges, shorten sentences, or avoid prosecution entirely by offering information about others. Truth becomes currency, and freedom becomes something that can be bargained for rather than earned through innocence. What makes this especially disturbing is the imbalance it creates. Those with deeper connections or higher positions in criminal networks often have more valuable information to trade. Lower-level offenders with less to offer absorb harsher punishment, while more dangerous individuals walk away lighter because they knew more names, routes, or secrets. Guilt becomes less important than usefulness. This system also incentivizes distortion. When freedom depends on information, accuracy becomes secondary to survival. Some informants exaggerate, omit, or fabricate details to appear valuable. Investigations can be steered by self-interest rather than truth, quietly reshaping cases around what was said, not what actually happened. Once deals are made, reversing course becomes difficult, even when doubts emerge. Psychologically, This corrodes trust in outcomes. Victims may learn that the person responsible for their harm faced minimal consequences, not because the crime was minor, but because it was profitable to let them go. It teaches a disturbing lesson that knowledge can outweigh accountability. The most unsettling part is how normalized this feels within the system. It doesn't look like corruption, it looks like strategy. Justice continues to function, but unevenly, shaped by leverage rather than harm, leaving behind the sense that freedom is sometimes granted, not for doing right, but for knowing enough to escape. Mishandled evidence frees killers. This fact is unsettling because it shows how justice can fail without anyone denying the truth. Evidence is meant to protect reality inside a system built on rules, yet when it is mishandled, truth becomes unusable. A mistake doesn't need to prove innocence. It only needs to introduce doubt, and doubt is enough to dismantle an entire case. What makes this especially disturbing is how small the errors can be. A mislabeled bag, a broken chain of custody, improper storage, contamination, or undocumented handling can render crucial evidence legally worthless. The facts may still point clearly to guilt, but the process no longer does. Courts do not judge what happened. They judge what can be proven correctly. These failures often happen long before a trial begins. Overworked departments, inadequate training, outdated facilities, and rushed procedures create conditions where mistakes are almost inevitable. Once exposed, those mistakes overshadow everything else. The focus shifts away from the crime and onto the error, allowing the accused to walk free without ever being declared innocent. Psychologically, this is deeply unsettling because it reveals how fragile accountability really is. It suggests that guilt and consequence are not always connected, and that outcomes depend as much on procedure as on truth. For victims' families, this feels like a second loss, watching justice dissolve over technicalities they never caused. The most disturbing part is that the system absorbs these outcomes quietly. A release is processed, a case is closed, and life moves on administratively. The killer is free not because the truth was wrong, but because it was handled imperfectly, and that imperfection was enough to erase consequence entirely.